A warm welcome to the World Economic Forum here in Davos, Switzerland. I'm Julia Chatterley, and it's the first ever springtime meeting and the first in person, of course, since the pandemic began. There's no shortage, clearly, of urgent issues to discuss for business leaders, for world leaders. Let me just walk you through what we're seeing at this moment. It includes, of course, the 3-month-old war in Ukraine, the increased risk of global recession, an escalating global food crisis, as well as the ongoing COVID pandemic. The head of the IMF saying today that the global economy faces its biggest test since World War II. Delegates also hearing from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who made another impassioned plea for more aggressive, fresh sanctions on Russia in a virtual address earlier today. Just listen to this.
There should be maximum, so that Russia and every other potential aggressor who wants to wage a brutal war against its neighbor would clearly know the immediate consequences for their actions. And I believe there's still no such sanctions against Russia. And there should be. There should be Russian oil embargo. All the Russian banks should be blocked. No exceptions.
Okay, it's fine.
There is no better person to discuss this with than Richard Quest, who joins us now. Number 21.
I think so, yes, 21.
I believe, for you. And the sun may be out, but oh boy, the clouds are gathering, and you feel it, I think, in the conversations that you're having here.
Completely. This is a time for serious people in serious places. And so, yes, whilst there's a lot of froth, if you will, on the promenade and the cyber this and the Bitcoin that and all that, in the conference centre, every conversation I've had, first of all, you've got to remember, a lot of people aren't here. So the only people who are here are those who really felt it was important to come here to actually, as a policymaker, to be involved in the discussions. So the level of debate and discussion here is 4 or 5 notches higher than we've seen in recent years at Davos. There is really serious furrowed brows, and what I'm hearing again and again is everybody saying this is absolutely the most difficult time with the destruction of all the values that we'd held dear.
I mean, there's so many things here. Do you trust those serious people in the room to be able to address the crises? And there's so many. Where do you even start? Whether it's still COVID, it's the climate crisis, which we often talk about here, but we've got it's so far beyond central banks responding to inflation. It's a cost of living crisis everywhere in the world. It's sort of whack-a-mole, and everything you do to try and tackle that increases the pain.
Yes, there's no easy solutions. So you're right, absolutely. But Ukraine is the number one, because Ukraine...
Is it?
Yes, of course, because from Ukraine flows out all the other issues. As long as the war in Ukraine continues, so you end up with supply chain issues. Yes, China's got that as well, but you get with serious food issues as long as Russia and Ukraine have that. And you have the energy issues with Germany, Hungary and Italy. So the war in Ukraine is by far the most instant, in a sense, crisis that needs to be, at least it can't be dealt with, but managed as best we can.
You know, the chief of the World Food Programme, David Beasley, said to me on a panel earlier today that thank you, Richard, not opening the port in Odessa and allowing that grain to flow is, in effect, a declaration of war against food security. And I don't think you could say it better. Like, we have to be having these discussions here now. And the question is, and the risk perhaps is that we get fatigued.
Oh, totally. What happens after the summer? When people in Europe come back after the first vacations in 2 years, decent holidays in 2 years, they come back, the war's still going, energy prices are high. The UK, one of the leading UK suppliers, said yesterday expecting even higher bills. And that food security you talked about.
Yes.
So, OK, in the developed world, it's from inflation. In the developing world, it's because they simply can't get the grain. Egypt, the Sudan, wherever it might be, they can't get the grain from Russia or Ukraine.
Well, let's be clear, it was already a food crisis. It's just escalated for all of these reasons. There's so many things we have to address.
But if this is still going on, God forbid, after the summer, then people will start to say, my fuel bill's just gone up 70%. My weekly food bill has gone up 40%. And why? The real risk with this danger, or the real danger, is that we start to accept Russia territorial gains in the eastern part of Ukraine as being the price for getting this over and done with. That's something that Biden, it's something that von der Leyen, Schultz, Macron, Boris Johnson, that's what they're going to have to face.
And I'm just doing the maths there. Not one of those faces an election of sorts later this year. What about US midterms coming if those are the kind of pressures? And it's not, hey, I blame Russia for it. I blame my policymakers for not acting enough to tackle it. Richard, I'm being told, though, we have to wrap up.
It's the economy, stupid. That was the phrase.
Yes.
That was the phrase, and that will come back to haunt.
So many of them.
Sorry, I'll go now.
No, you'll be back. Okay. Thank you, Richard. Richard Quest there. As we were just mentioning, President Biden making unexpected headlines in Tokyo this morning, surprising his top aides yet again. The president was asked if the United States military would get involved if China invaded Taiwan. And this was his response.
You didn't want to get involved in the Ukraine conflict militarily for obvious reasons. Are you willing to get involved militarily to defend Taiwan if it comes to that?
Yes.
You are?
That's the commitment we made. We agree with a one China policy. We signed on to it and all the attendant agreements made from there. But the idea that it can be taken by force, just taken by force, is just not appropriate. It will dislocate the entire region and be another action similar to what happened in Ukraine.
The White House working quickly to clarify the president's comments. Blake Essig joins us now to discuss. Blake, I think my first response to this is, ouch, simply. Obviously, you would expect a welcoming of these comments from Taiwan, less so, to say the least, over in China.
Yeah, absolutely, Julia. I mean, no question, this was the biggest line to come out of the press conference between President Biden and Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. Immediately, CNN was told by multiple sources, several of President Biden's top administrative officials, that they were caught off guard when he made those comments. And just moments afterwards, the White House clarified that the U.S. policy of strategic ambiguity on Taiwan hadn't changed, making it less clear whether military intervention would happen. Now, as part of that strategic ambiguity, it's important to remember that the U.S. provides Taiwan defensive weapons, but has remained intentionally ambiguous on whether it would intervene militarily in the event of a Chinese attack. China has since responded to President Biden's comment, urging the U.S. to earnestly follow the one China policy, under which the U.S. acknowledges China's claim of sovereignty over Taiwan. And as you played earlier, during that press conference, President Biden did elaborate, essentially saying that the U.S. agrees with the one China policy, but that the idea that Taiwan could be taken by force isn't appropriate. President Biden has gone further than his administration's public policy before on this matter, as he did last fall during a CNN town hall, also forcing aides back then to walk his comments back. Of course, there have been rising concerns that China might be emboldened to go after Taiwan after watching Russia invade Ukraine. And previously, Prime Minister Kishida has hinted that he sees parallels between Russia's actions in Europe and China's expansion into the Indo-Pacific. Now, on the security front, along with agreeing to continue monitoring Chinese and Russian joint military drills in the region, the two leaders did discuss the importance of peace and stability on the Taiwan Strait, saying each country remains committed to making sure that China doesn't change the status quo by force. But also, President Biden made it clear that the U.S. is fully committed to Japan's defense, while Prime Minister Kishida said Japan would not rule out any options, including counterattack capabilities. Julie, domestically here in Japan, there's been a push to increase defense spending from 1% to 2% of GDP and improve its defensive capability within the framework of the country's pacifist constitution. The two leaders also talked about countering China economically. It was a primary focus of today's bilateral meeting, with Prime Minister Kishida saying that Japan would participate in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework that was announced by President Biden last October. Now, at this point, the jury is still out on this economic plan that's built on trade, supply chains, clean energy, decarbonization, infrastructure, tax, and anti-corruption. But experts say a lack of clarity, substance, and the U.S.'s recent unimpressive commitment of $150 million to Southeast Asia compared to the billions China has invested makes it a tough sell. That all being said, Julia, so far, 12 Asian nations are planning to join President Biden's economic plan for Asia. Again, the main objective to counter China economically as far as their influence in the region is concerned.
Yeah, Blake, you named it there. I mean, the whole list of issues, things to discuss, far outweigh the one issue, which is the definition concerns over the United States' relationship with the likes of China and Taiwan. So I'm glad that we also shed light on some of those strategic relationships and the importance of them for so many reasons. Blake, great to have you with us. Blake Essig there. Now, here at the World Economic Forum, the war in Ukraine, as Richard was saying, front and centre, with a dramatically altered security landscape just among many of the consequences. Russia went into Ukraine hoping to stop the expansion of NATO. Instead, its aggression triggered membership bids from both Sweden and Finland. And joining us now is Mikael Damberg. He's Sweden's finance minister. Minister, fantastic to have you on the show. Thank you for joining us. There's too much to discuss, but we'll begin talking about NATO because this is very important. And of course, there were discussions over the weekend, Turkey, who's seemingly standing in the way of your future membership, and Finland's, laying out their conditions. Can those conditions be met? Should they be met?
I think from a perspective, we have now for 200 years been a non-aligned country. We had discussions with all NATO membership countries before our application, and now Turkey says that they have some remarks and positions. So of course,
their position changed.
Yes, their position changed.
Yes.
So now we'll have to have a dialogue, and also our Prime Minister has had a talk with Erdogan, and both bilaterally and together with Finland and together with NATO, because we see that many of the NATO membership countries actually want Finland and Sweden joining NATO in our strategic position in Northern Europe, but also with our military capacities. So of course this has to be handled.
Can they be convinced?
No, I think I shouldn't speculate, because I understand that Turkey in some other cases have had raised questions and sometimes they have been solved. So we're working very constructively together with them, having dialogue. But of course, this is a bigger question that not only involves Sweden, Finland and Turkey. It involves the whole of NATO.
It does. You have the luxury, or at least the foresight, of not having the same strategic level of reliance in terms of energy on Russia, but your country feeling the consequences like many others, whether it's food price rises, whether it's energy price rises. What do you make of what we're seeing? Because there's multifold crises that we're discussing here in Davos, and the whole world's having to grapple with and decide how best to respond. It's not easy, particularly when you have elections coming up.
Yeah. Of course, we see an effect on our growth, not as high as we expected before the war, but still a stable growth. We see higher prices, but we also see the long-term perspective that Europe really has to unlock our dependence on Russian oil and gas. So this must be the time where we actually step up and do more of the green transition. And what we see in Sweden, in our perspective, that's really creating jobs in Sweden now. We have huge investments in the green industries in Sweden. So we see the possibilities also inside a crisis.
Do you think other nations get that?
No, I think many countries don't see the possibility to actually have economic growth and job creation and green transition on the same time. But Sweden and some other Nordic countries actually are the example that shows it's possible. Now we have huge investments in northern part of Sweden, in steel industries, in the battery industry, the car industry, the renewable energy side. So this really creates tens of thousands of jobs in our Rust Belt, in our part of society where the development has gone the wrong way in decades, now actually sees new jobs and lower unemployment.
Do you worry about the risk of global recession?
Of course, we see that as a possible threat.
But not an inevitability.
Not inevitability. It's how we handle the crisis. And also, it depends on what Russia do in Ukraine. Of course, that could set up even a bigger fire in the global economy.
And if we look at the situation today, you've played down the risk of some form of retaliation from Russia, and as you began at the beginning of this conversation, we'll see what happens with Turkey in the NATO situation. But, you know, there's a dual war going on here. There's a sort of cyber security risk war, and that's playing into democracies, into societies. How prepared are you? Because that also has to be a piece of the defence budget spending that you're focused on, and it's sort of an underrepresented, reported risk, I think, at this moment too. Are you prepared for that?
I think Sweden is a digital frontrunner. We have the Ericsson, the 5G, we have the gaming companies, we have the banks being very digitalized.
And it's
yes, so that's my point. That's my point. So very far ahead in digitalization, and that brings also risks and insecurities. So for us, we're aiming at this, pointing at this, and we have to raise awareness, but we also have to gather all the competences in a cybersecurity center that has been inspired what they've done in London and Great Britain. So and we try to have an international cooperation. It's not only Sweden; it's a European issue. It's also linked with our American partners, so we try to work very close to them as well.
Is there reasons to be optimistic? Because I do think the mood here is very concerned about what we're seeing and the uncertainties of what we're facing at this moment, because that's the key. It's not like we have all the answers. We don't.
The uncertainties are bigger now than before, yes, but it depends on how to handle the crisis. And for Sweden, we're kind of in a golden position. We have strong public finances, we have the green transition already happening. So for us, it's easier, but I'm more worried about the global scale, the poorer countries in the world that actually will be very hard hit by the prices on food, for instance. So to also have a global perspective here in Davos is very important.
Yeah, you're right. It's always the poorest and perhaps the weakest that are hurt most in these kind of crises, and we have to keep talking about them. Minister, great to have you with us. Thank you so much. Sweden's Minister of Finance there, Mikael Damberg. Okay, coming up here in Davos, the head of semiconductor giant Intel and much more. We'll discuss the global chip shortage, plus tackling vaccine inequality. The CEO of the Serum Institute of India, one of the world's largest vaccine manufacturers, is coming right up. Stay with us. Welcome back to Davos here in Switzerland. President Biden's stern warning to China over Taiwan, a reminder of its importance amid a global semiconductor shortage. Taiwan, of course, one of the world's biggest manufacturers of those chips, and one of the companies also working to tackle this supply issue in the longer term is tech giant Intel. And joining us now, I'm pleased to say, is the Intel CEO, Patrick Gelsinger. Sir, fantastic to have you with us.
Thank you. What a joy. What a great spot.
I know. Despite the challenging discussions that are taking place here, and it's nice not to have the snow. You've said it, I think, in really powerful terms, that everything that's going on, be it COVID, be it Shanghai port closures, the challenges, the issues that we have, and they're vast with chips, are going to push into 2024. My question to you is, why is this not putting a giant rocket up the behind, politely, of US Congress to say, get the CHIPS Act done?
Well, I couldn't be more anxious, excited, and aligned with that view. Let's get it done.
Yeah.
You know, strong Republican support, strong Democrat support, pass the Senate, pass the House. Time to get it conferenced and get it on the president's desk. He has said clearly, I want to sign this ASAP. I want it done before the summer recess in July so that we can go bigger and faster with our build out.
What's the holdup then? Is it just, I guess some of the Republicans saying they don't want to give Biden a win before the US midterms? Does it come down to posturing and politics?
Well, you know, nothing happens fast in Washington. You know, and if I was running a business that way, you know, boy, you know, we get
to business.
Yeah, but you know, we now feel like we're close to the finish line, and I'd say every one of your listeners, tell your representative or your senator, get this finished now. It is overdue because the world is moving on.
Yeah,
right? We've seen strong actions in India, strong actions in Korea, Japan, you know, and here in EU, you know, they started a year later than the U.S. CHIPS Act. And I will probably see euros before I see dollars.
And you are making massive investments accordingly. I mean, you've made investments admittedly in Ohio, and that's part of the bigger plan. But you've also said, and there is talk that this could be a $100 billion investment over the next decade. Do you need that CHIPS Act in the United States to do it? Because you'd put the money there surely anyway. But hey, how about a bit of incentive?
Yeah, and I've said very clearly, you know, we're going to go small and slow in Ohio, or we're going to go big and fast. It is very simple, because without the incentive dollars, we're not competitive worldwide. And that's what caused this. Now, think about it. You know, 30 years ago, 80% of this industry was in US and Europe. Today, 80% of it's in Asia. How did that happen?
Yeah.
Right? Well, what happened was there were strong policies in Taiwan, Korea, and China, you know, because Congress never in the US said we don't want this industry, but those Asian countries said we do. And they put strong policies in place. And what the CHIPS Act is designed is to bring that back to parity across the world.
It's about better balance.
Indeed, right? It's just saying I can't make major manufacturing investments like this in the U.S. if they're not competitive, right? You know, then I can't compete in the world scale. That's exactly what we're asking for. Get us back to competitive, you know, put those long-term research dollars at play. That's the heart of the CHIPS Act. Get it done.
You have to make big decisions, long-term decisions at a time of incredible uncertainty. And I think that's part of the backdrop and the discussions that are taking place. And we've seen that sort of shakedown, I think, in tech stocks. But of course, it's across the board. There's the sort of growth fears, there's cost of living crisis fears. And you can tell me to what extent all of that feeds into your latest earnings, because even when I look at the client computing business, there seemed to be a reticence to put a bit of money to work. How long does that play out? What's the recession risk? And I know it's sort of finger in the wind, but give me your sense.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of economic softening, right? You know, as we're seeing some consumer pull back as well. And, you know, we were so hot for so long. I also say some of it maybe allows us to have a period of a bit of supply-demand rebalancing as well. Fundamentally, the business market is unquestionably strong. Right, and we continue to see that, and that's where, you know, I think the most acute things, you know, building automobiles and getting factories built are strong. But, you know, hey, there's probably a little bit of inflation, monetary tightening that's going to cause a bit more of a reprieve. But fundamentally, our investments, you know, it takes me 4 years to build a new factory. I cannot make those judgments on a quarterly basis when we see the industry doubling between now and the end of the decade. So our investment policies are through the decade, and we are going to make those strategic investments. Even if there's a little bit of bump for a quarter or two along the way, that's okay, because this is a long-term play.
What are we least prepared for? I mean, there are, what was it that the IMF chief said, a calamity, a cascade of calamities. That's not her words, but it's a pretty good one, a phrase, to deal with here. What worries you most, and what are we least prepared for?
Well, you know, I think all of these supply chain disruptions, you know, have just given us such a stark wake-up call. You know, and I call it that we've gone from just-in-time supply chains, and what we need to do is go to just-in-case. supply chains. We need resilience in all of these things. And I've said, geopolitics across the world has been defined by where the oil reserves are for the last 5 decades. For the next several decades, where the fabs are is more important, because every aspect of human existence is becoming more digital. Everything digital runs on semiconductors. Build the fabs where we want them.
Does it matter more than food? I'm on a crusade here because we have a global food crisis around the world, and it's escalating, and part of that is the war in Ukraine. Is that in addition to what you're talking about? Because the idea that even fabs and semiconductors are more important than energy today is a bold statement to me.
It is. But, I'd also say as we look at the food supply,
yeah.
How those supply chain managed, right, through digital. How are, the next generation...
And can be better managed.
Yeah, and how are the next generation of, self-driving tractors and automation of food generation? It's all based on digital. So, it is so foundational to every aspect of human existence, that we just got to get it done.
It's fascinating. You're going to come back and talk to me more purely about your business. That's the beauty and the pain of Davos in the ways that we talk about so much. But you sort of positioned VMware before you became the chief of Intel, but you had 30 years experience, let's be clear, at Intel too. I want to ask you about pay, because shareholders of Intel recently voted down what was a near $118 million pay package for you. Tough question. Is that fair? You couldn't bring more expertise, and I think more proven expertise in what you've done. How do you convince them?
Well, the pay package, as it is, it was sort of 3 parts. One was a base salary and base compensation, which is the 50th percentile of CEOs.
Yeah.
So you sort of say, that's fair, right in the middle, right? And then there was, essentially taking off the table what I was already at no risk from VMware.
Yeah.
And the third was other incentives that are entirely aligned with shareholders. I don't get a penny of that if the stock doesn't perform. So you can go calculate how much that's worth, but it's worth 0 if shareholders don't get an extraordinary payout as well. So in that sense, hey, I think it's reasonable. At the same time, finally, I'm going to give most of it to charity anyway.
Now that's a great point. How much?
Well, my wife and I made a commitment years ago that we were going to give an increasing percentage of our gross salary to charity every year. That's over 50% of our gross salary now, and it's just going to keep going up. So clearly, the majority of this is going to go to charity in all circumstances. If I get a little bit or I get a lot, we're excited to improve the world for as many people as we possibly can. That's the Intel model and vision that we say that we are going to work on technologies that improve the life of every person on the planet, and that's my personal dream as well.
And it's an important message. You're standing your ground, sir. Great to chat to you.
Thank you so much.
We'll reconvene. There is much to discuss. Thank you, the Intel CEO there. All right, we're going to take a break. Stage ahead. The Ukrainian flags are flying high at Davos as President Zelensky calls for action, more action from world leaders. We'll be joined by one of the Ukrainian lawmakers representing their country here at the summit. Stay with CNN. Welcome back. Ukraine's President Zelensky warning that up to 100 people could be dying every day in the east of the country as the war grinds on. And in the meantime, Ukraine's first war crimes trial came to a close this morning too. A 21-year-old Russian soldier was sentenced to life in prison for killing an unarmed man. Melissa Bell joins us now from Kyiv in Ukraine. Melissa, great to have you with us. I guess we can suggest that this is the beginnings of some form of justice, but the truth is the war rages on.
That's right, Julia, and that's what made this particular case being held in a civilian court, even while the war rages on, so particular, so extraordinary, so unique, really. 21-year-old Vadim Shishimarin found guilty and sentenced to life in jail for having killed an unarmed civilian on the fourth day of the war. Now, he and his column had been coming in. Some of his men had then escaped in a stolen car. He'd been given the order to shoot the civilian in order that the civilian not report us. Now, Vadim Shishimarin intends to appeal. He says that he was following orders. That is his defense. But the verdict, as it was read, took 50 minutes to read out, with the judge really going to great lengths to explain the nature of Ukrainian law, that Vadim Shishimarin was being sentenced for having killed a premeditated murder that is in violation of the customs and laws of war. And I think the fact that it took so long was really a reminder of the fact that this trial happens in that context. They have also explained to us, the prosecutors, that they want to move ahead with these trials because it is about sending a strong signal, Julia, to those Russian soldiers even now fighting in eastern Ukraine. But the other aspect of this civilian court ruling, even as the war rages on, is that it happens, of course, even as prisoners of war are now being held on the Russian side of this war. We heard this morning from the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs that it was willing to look at the possibility of prisoner of war exchanges with regard to those Azovstal fighters. Remember that as we speak now, Julia, those 2,500 or so Azovstal fighters that fought till the bitter end to try and defend Mariupol, handed themselves over in full by Friday night, are now prisoners of war in the Donetsk People's Republic. We've been hearing today from the leader of the Donetsk People's Republic that a tribunal is being prepared even now so that the men can face trials of their own. So there is, even as the battle goes on in the east, this extraordinary tale of two judicial systems playing out as well, Julia.
Yeah, we'll continue to watch that too. Melissa Bell, thank you for joining us there from Kyiv. Now, here in Davos, Ukrainian President Zelensky kicked off the summit with a call for maximum sanctions against Russia. And meanwhile, the venue typically used by the Russian delegation to promote itself has undergone a rebrand, known this year as the Russian War Crimes House. It puts the violence and devastation in Ukraine on display for everyone to see. We're joined now by Ukrainian President of Parliament, Alona Shkrum. Alona, great to have you with us. Why are you here? What's the message that you bring? And obviously President Zelensky was chosen as a keynote to kick off this forum. Do you think he's being heard here, if not around the world too?
I really hope he's been heard. I think he's shown this new kind of honesty, a new kind of diplomacy. The standard diplomacy did not work for Ukraine. The standard, tone of voice and the standard phrases did not work for Ukraine to stop this war and not help it to continue. So he's been very honest. He's been very straightforward. He's been telling, because it is like an economic forum, what he exactly wants, what investment do we need, what we need countries to do more. And I hope he's being heard. I mean, I've seen U.S. senators actually having tears in their eyes while he was talking and finishing his speech. So it's a very emotional time for us, but we really appreciate, not the words, but the deeds that we have here.
He's proved brilliant, I think, on a regular basis at holding a mirror up to the world and making them ask themselves incredibly tough questions. And that's the key to your point, I think, about action too. What concrete action can you get? Because we have to talk about rebuilding. We have to talk about a broader Marshall Plan. And I know the IMF chief has talked about that. Are you having those conversations here to business? What city can you take ownership of? Can you help rebuild? Just talk us through some of those conversations.
So basically, we are here with a women delegation. It's 5 members of parliament who are women. For men, it's much difficult more to leave the country. They don't want to leave the country. Some of them are fighting, even members of parliament. So we are here with so-called women battalion, a diplomatic battalion. And we are here each on a specific task. I would say there are 4 things that we need to cover and we are covering. First is obviously showing the real pictures, what is going on in Kiev, in Odessa, in Mariupol. Right now, President Zelensky said that people just died yesterday. This is the first time of my life where I'm so scared to open the phone in the morning because a person I know might be dead, and a person I knew who was creating amazing festivals in Odessa region, a kite surfer, just was shot 2 days ago because he was evacuating people from the east to Odessa. So those are the horrifying things that we need to talk about. Even, even in this nice spring atmosphere, this is something we have to. Yeah, this is the first task. The second task is purely economic one. We have meetings with heads of CEOs of the biggest companies. We have meetings with investments. We have meetings with world leaders and country leaders who can take mentorship over specific regions. This is the idea that has been there for a number of months, but we have regions and cities which have very close ties with some of the European countries. For example, Mariupol is actually a Greek city, and Greece have told us a number of times that we are ready to help, we are ready to help rebuild it, we are ready to help the tourism develop after the war, after we win, of course. Odessa is a very francophone city. They spoke French there, we have French people there. It was built by a French architect, so obviously it would make sense for France to help with Odessa region, with the tourism, with the culture, with the investment. And there are specific companies who are interested in very specific areas of expertise, IT, robotics, digitalization, even now when the war is still going. So we are having those discussions.
Great.
Yeah,
and this is a rallying cry for you here as well. Yeah. So if businesses want to take ownership, have not yet been in contact, this is the moment where they can, and you're here and ready for
exactly,
those discussions.
Exactly. The more painful discussions are also the discussions that there are businesses here who are still operating in Russia, and there are still countries who allow, like Germany and Italy, allow their companies to pay for Russian gas in rubles. So they're basically sponsoring Putin to continue this war, while we here need actually to stop this war as fast as possible. And in Ukraine, believe me, we don't want this tragedy to come to any other part of the world. We don't want it to be in Poland. We don't want this war to go to Finland, even though Putin threatens them a number of times. This needs to stop with Ukrainian forces on Ukrainian territory.
I will make the point that there is a real grey area over those euro-ruble swaps that are going on, and we're going to push for clarification this week, I promise you. And the other thing I think is some of those businesses, and I've spoken to a number of them too, are making tough decisions, particularly those in the food industry, because the global food crisis is exacerbated if Russia's fertilizer, Russia's grain doesn't get to the world too. So do you fight a bigger food crisis war, or do you try and help Ukraine with the war they're dealing with? I want to go to that because the breadbasket of the world, Ukraine, those ports, beyond anything need opening, because then it's not just your war, it's a war that goes on around the world to feed people. And you're here to promote that message too.
Yeah, this is our fourth task, actually. You are completely right, because this is something we need very urgently. I mean, all of the messages are urgent, but this is something we need to be done and to be dealt before August, probably, because Ukraine is a breadbasket for Africa, for countries of the Northern Africa, Middle East. Even in France, the price of croissants has already increased because we were not able to export the grains. Our storages are full. Our farmers are in bulletproof vests right now, taking it under the bombings, and they're doing everything they need, and they will continue to do that. But we need to deblock the ports in Odessa, and we need the NATO warships, we need the specific country ships to guarantee a safe passage through the Black Sea to those countries who need it. Because, you know, we've had COVID already, we've had the war, and we are having the war in Europe. We don't need hunger in the world. I think that is too much for Putin to take, and this is the catastrophe that he is trying to do. He is trying to be a terrorist who is terrorizing the whole world for the hunger right now.
Putin responsible potentially for a global famine, because that's where we could be headed.
Yes, yes, and he should be trialed for that in Hague or in any other international tribunal.
Alona Shkrom, the part of the battalion that was sent from Ukraine to spread the word, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
A powerful message. Okay. Okay, still to come. 2 years into the pandemic and the world's still battling to get COVID vaccines to the most vulnerable. We'll speak to the CEO of the world's largest vaccine manufacturer by volume next. The Serum Institute of India. Stay with us. Welcome back to a common message here at the World Economic Forum, and that is that the rich are getting richer. A new report by Oxfam shows some 573 people have become billionaires since 2020. That means a new billionaire was minted nearly every day during the pandemic. At the same time, rising food prices around the world could push more than 260 million people into extreme poverty this year alone. And one big area of inequality is the supply and the distribution of COVID vaccines. My next guest took the lead on vaccine production in India for the rest of the world too, delivering 1.5 billion doses of its vaccine by the end of 2021. Joining us now is Zadar Poonawalla. He's the CEO of the Serum Institute of India. The institute is the world's largest vaccine maker by volume, and its shots are mainly distributed to low-income countries worldwide. A huge pleasure finally to meet face to face. So it's interesting. The last time you and I were talking was Digital Davos earlier this year. Yes. And while everybody else was saying, look, we've got a supply crisis, we need to talk about the inequality, you were saying, hang on a second, guys, I'm not pointing fingers, but I think we've got a demand problem. And specifically across the African continent, you were concerned about the demand, about orders, about getting shots into arms. Tell me where we are today.
Well, I mean, we're not in a very different place to that at the moment. You know, in November, when India lifted its temporary restriction, like most countries had their restrictions, our restriction went on a little bit longer. But as soon as that was over, we offered hundreds of millions of doses to the African continent. But, you know, sadly, their absorption capacity has not been to the level that we all hoped, and we're all working together closely with them to try and...
Why? What's going on?
Well, it's a combination of factors. You know, as cases and the severity of COVID has gone down globally, especially in, on the African continent, which is, of course, a good thing, you know, the urgency to come forward to take vaccinations has sort of dwindled, and so they've had their challenges that way.
And there's lots of cost priorities to make as well, given the multifold crises that are going on, I guess. Are you talking to China, by the way?
Well, we wouldn't have a problem providing them vaccines if they need it, but I think given the geopolitical situation, it would probably be tough for them to have a vaccine made in India, but we're happy to help any nation that needs treatments for COVID-19.
A diplomatic response, and the answer is no, to your point. It's anecdotal, but it's my own experience. I flew from New York, where cases are rapidly rising. I'm vaccinated, I've had a booster, I got COVID and I got pretty sick. And I was mRNA platform
I'm sorry to hear that.
vaccinated. And, I speak to people who are increasingly skeptic about needing boosters every 6 months. Why should I? Aren't vaccines supposed to work every 5 to 10 years? And you've made some pointed comments that perhaps play to the vaccines that you distribute, but you believe there's a difference between mRNA platforms and the more traditional, like the AstraZenecas of the world.
Yeah.
What do we need to understand from your perspective?
Yeah, so look, I don't have any biases. I'm just a manufacturer. The way I look at it is that you want a vaccine that ideally would prevent transmission. Sadly, these vaccines have not been able to prevent transmission of disease, but all of them have worked very well in reducing the severity and preventing hospitalizations and deaths. Now, from my perspective, a good vaccine would be one that gives you a long-term T-cell response. The messenger RNA vaccines are very good. They provide a good protection, but require a lot of boosting as well. And, it's a new technology, and we're all very excited to see what happens in the future. But I've usually made and manufactured the traditional vaccines with the traditional technologies. And, we're very excited of the future of what messenger RNA can bring to the vaccine space.
But are you worried about skepticism? Because I'm hearing it. People going, I've had vaccines in the past. I get a booster and I'm done for life, or I'm done for 10 years. And we have to get our mindset around the idea that, fine, if you're cutting out hospitalizations and you're cutting out deaths, then that's phenomenal. But you still have to get people to go back every 6 months and get a booster.
That's always a challenge.
That's a problem.
That's always a challenge, because you need to get your information from the right sources. Today, with social media and skepticism, as you mentioned, naturally that would create fear in people's minds. I think any vaccine that you can get your hands on is a good vaccine. That's the way to put it.
Doing both, though. Do an mRNA and do a AstraZeneca.
That combination has worked out quite well to give you a best of both worlds, to speak, to put it that way, and it's giving you a longer-term response as well.
I have to ask, monkeypox. I don't even know what to say to follow that. I'm not sure the world can even bear to read the word. What do we need to understand?
Well, I think we've just got fatigue of all these diseases and potential new pandemics. I think the way to look at it is it does seem to need prolonged exposure to be transmitted and contagious.
It's the message, don't panic.
So messages, don't panic. I think we'll wait and watch to get more information and data of how it's spreading and how to treat it. So I think it's still too early and we shouldn't panic.
No, it's interesting. You're also a prolific investor. And I was looking at your CV, investments in microfinance, wellness provider, a firm that manufactures test kits for COVID-19. You're also not above giving Elon Musk investment advice too, and I saw it on Twitter. You said, look, if he doesn't buy Twitter in the end, he should come and make cars in India.
Yeah, he'll have some spare cash left over, and there's no better place to invest in India. The regulatory environment, the talent, the hard work and commitment of the workforce, it's ideally suited to manufacturing of any kind.
Would they be welcome?
Absolutely.
Really?
We want as many foreign companies to come into India, especially as an alternative, to China even, where you've got, as I mentioned, a great dedicated workforce, good environment, regulatory procedures. I think they just need to work out their logistics on that, and I hope they come.
Elon, if you're listening, have you had a response from him, by the way?
I don't think so. I'll double check though, but he's very active, so I'm not as active as he is. Let me check if he's responded.
Great to have you with us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for all the work
Pleasure.
you and your team have
Thank
done.
you.
Adam Hinawala there, the CEO of the Serum Institute of India. Coming up after the break, fresh from his meeting with President Biden, South Korea's new president speaking exclusively to CNN. Our live report from Seoul up next. Welcome back. Before heading to Japan, President Biden visited South Korea, meeting with the country's new leader. And President Yoon Suk-yeol has spoken exclusively to CNN, the first interview he's given since his inauguration just 2 weeks ago. Paula Hancock is live in Seoul, and great access, Paula. An important relationship clearly to court in the United States, but I guess one of the key questions here is, will that have consequences for another important relationship, and that is China? Just one of the things we can focus on here.
Well, that's right, Julia. I mean, it was an interesting day to speak to the President, Yoon Suk-yeol, considering it's the day that President Biden announced that 13 nations were going to be joining his Indo-Pacific economic framework, including South Korea. Now, I did ask him about this in the interview, why he felt the need to be part of this group, and he said that it was very important for his country's national interest.
If we don't actively participate in the process of making these rules for economic exchanges and trade with the countries within the Indo-Pacific region, it would be a great loss to our national interest. So I think it's only natural that we participate in this.
Now, at the same time, he also pointed out that he was considering joining working groups for some of the Quad meetings as well. So clearly he is considering and joining particular groups that are seen as counters to China. Now, bear in mind, China is South Korea's biggest trading partner, and China has staged economic retaliation against South Korea in the past. When they installed the THAAD missile defense system, for example, there was a crippling economic boycott that followed. So I did ask him whether he was concerned there could be some kind of backlash from Beijing.
Even if we strengthen our alliance with the United States in security and technology, it does not mean that we think our economic cooperation with China is unimportant. So I do not believe it is reasonable for China to be overly sensitive about this matter.
He also said that he believes China should, as one of the leading world powers, be part of the rule-based international order. Now, of course, with that order in such flux around the world at this point, South Korea's President Yoon was at pains to point out that at least for the next 5 years during his tenure, his country will be very much firmly standing next to the United States. Julia?
An interesting point to make, and to your very valid point there, world disorder, I think perhaps is a better phrase for it. Paul Hancock's in Seoul. Thank you so much for that. OK, that's it for the show from the World Economic Forum here in Davos. If you've missed any of our interviews today, they will be on my Twitter and Instagram pages shortly. You can search for @JChatterleyCNN. In the meantime, Connect the World with Becky Anderson is up next, and I'll see you tomorrow. Stay with CNN.
The court found Vadim Shishimarin guilty of committing a criminal offence under Part 2 of Article 438 of the Criminal Code of Ukraine.
The first war crimes conviction in the war in Ukraine handed down to this Russian soldier for the killing of an innocent civilian. And
as Russia pummeled the Mariupol steel plant with overwhelming firepower, Natalia Zaritska could only watch and pray for her husband Bogdan inside.
Well, her husband did survive, but is now a Russian captive. Nobody knows what will happen next, but the families cling to hope. Plus,
you didn't want to get involved in the Ukraine conflict militarily for obvious reasons. Are you willing to get involved militarily to defend Taiwan if it comes to that?
Yes.
Well, a show of support for Taiwan, but the US president's comments caught his own administration off guard. Well, it's 3 p.m. in London. I'm Becky Anderson. It's good to be back. Hello and welcome to Connect the World. Life in prison. The sentence in the first war crimes trial in Ukraine since the start of Russia's invasion. A court in Kyiv convicted a 21-year-old Russian soldier, seen here on the right of your screens, for fatally shooting an unarmed Ukrainian civilian in the early days of the war. He had pleaded guilty last week, expressing remorse and apologising to the victim's widow. Well, his defence lawyer argued that the blame should fall on Russian leaders who ordered their soldiers into war. Melissa Bell has been covering this trial for us in Kyiv since the start. She has more details on what is a landmark legal case in this war.
21-year-old Vadim Shishimarin bowing his head as the verdict was read out, the judge reading that verdict and sentencing for nearly 50 minutes, explaining that Vadim Shishimarin was being sentenced to spend the rest of his life in jail because he'd been found guilty of premeditated murder in violation of the customs and laws of war. This is a civilian court that was hearing this verdict, a civilian court in which this Russian soldier was being tried, even as the war continues all around. Have a listen to what the prosecutor had to say after that verdict and sentence were read out.
I think that all other law enforcement agencies will move along the path we have travelled. This will be a good example for other occupiers who may not yet be on our territory but are planning to come. Or those who are here now and plan to stay and fight. Or maybe they will think that it's time to leave here for their own territory.
The Kremlin saying that it will do what it can to assist Vadim Shishimarin, even as the Russian Foreign Ministry suggests that it is ready to consider some sort of prisoner of war exchange with regard to the Azovstal fighters currently in pre-trial detention centers in the Donetsk People's Republic. We've been hearing this morning from the head of the Donetsk People's Republic saying that those men will now be put on trial. Melissa Bell, CNN, Kyiv.
Well, you just heard Melissa there talk about this. Ukrainian soldiers who left the Azovstal steel plant in Mariupol reportedly will face tribunals. The pro-Russian separatist leader in Donetsk tells a Russian state news agency documents for those tribunals are now being prepared. Well, Russia's military says more than 2,000 Ukrainians surrendered from that steel plant. Ukrainian officials still in Mariupol say Russian forces are now requiring permits to enter and exit the city. The advisor to the city's Ukrainian mayor warning whoever does make it inside that, for now, it's a one-way trip. And I want to bring in Suzanne Malveaux, connecting us from Lviv in western Ukraine. I want to focus on Mariupol because, as I understand it, you've been speaking to one of the wives of the Azovstal soldier who surrendered. What's the latest on those soldiers, Suzanne?
Well, I've been speaking with Natalia Zaritska, and she essentially is really trying to get some sense of hope anywhere where she can. So President Zelensky's statement over the weekend that if they destroyed the people of Azovstal, that there would never be any negotiation or talks with Russians, that is something that she takes to heart. She is also just trying to remind herself of the qualities of her husband. She says he is a man of action, that he is strong. But the bottom line here is that she really just has no idea what is happening to her husband right now.
As Russia pummeled the Mariupol steel plant with overwhelming firepower, Natalia Zaritska could only watch and pray for her husband Bohdan inside. But Bohdan, a Ukrainian soldier, was able to update Natalia almost daily, she says, chronicling the worsening conditions.
He described the situation like the real hell, because people had no legs, no hands, and no medicine.
Weeks in, photos revealed Bohdan was jaundiced and had dropped weight.
He lost weight, approximately 20 kilos. But he has a very strong spirit.
He'd seen many of his friends killed and feared he was next. Following his commander's order, Thursday, Bohdan surrendered, telling Natalia he would lose all ability to communicate. Now, with his fellow soldiers in Russian custody, Natalia can only assume he's at their nearby detention center. Her greatest fear now, that he is being tortured or worse.
We write each message as the last one.
What is the last message that he typed to you?
I love you. He was worried about his mom. He asked me to let her know that he is alive and to wait for him.
Natalia believes Bohdan will give everything to stay alive, motivated by their shared desire to someday create a family.
And this idea helps me to be strong.
But the pain of not knowing is excruciating, the weight heavy, as Russia's attacks carry on.
And Natalia is among a small group of mothers as well as wives who are meeting with Turkish government officials, including the president, there to try to push and make a case for the release or some sort of prison swap for their loved ones who are being held by the Russians. As you had mentioned, the leader of the Russian-controlled Donetsk region saying they are now preparing documents for tribunals for at least some of the nearly 2,000, the Russians say at least that's their number, that are being held by their authorities. There is no information that Natalia is getting whether or not her husband is one of them. Becky?
Is, at this stage, as you understand it, is a prisoner swap realistic?
Well, certainly if they were to make a move to actually convince the Russians that that was possible at this point, Ukrainian officials don't really believe that that is likely at this moment. If there was some sort of change in the negotiations, some sort of game changer, perhaps that would make a difference. But at this time, what we have heard, that the Russians say that their investigative committee will be interrogating many of those that they have in custody, and that they will follow this process. And so it is not clear that there's reason to be optimistic about that right now, Becky.
Suzanne Malveaux is in Ukraine for you. Well, thank you, Suzanne. Nearly 3 months into this war, Ukraine's president has taken his case for post-war investment in his country to the world's financial leaders. Volodymyr Zelensky addressing the World Economic Forum in Davos earlier, calling investments in rebuilding his country a huge economic opportunity, but adds it would be the biggest since World War II. Before that rebuilding can begin, Mr. Zelensky says Russia must pay a price for its invasion of his country. He's calling for a complete halt in trade with Russia. Richard Quest has covered the World Economic Forum for many years. He joins us now live from Davos. Different time of the year, different backdrop for you in Davos, an entirely different backdrop as far as the world is concerned as well, with this ongoing war in Europe. Richard, President Zelensky wants a full stop on trade with Russia. Is that feasible? Or is there an argument that it would cause more problems than it would solve at this point?
I think it's a bit of both. You could do it because Russia is now de facto cut off from such large swathes of the global economy. But what about China, India, and those countries that have so far refused to sign on to the sanctions such as that have already been imposed? The Zelensky speech really fell into three distinct groups. In the first part, it was a reminder of 1938, a reminder that the price of a dictator only ever gets higher, and it's time to deal with it now, or you'll only have to pay more later. Then you had what you were saying about the rebuilding that's likely to take place, or the bonanza that there would be in terms of construction and the like for rebuilding, and where that money would come from. And then you got to the bit reminding the people here their promises on sanctions and saying now is the time to ratchet them up. This is President Zelensky this morning.
There should be Russian oil embargo. All the Russian banks should be blocked. No exceptions. There should be an abandonment of the Russian IT sector. There should not be any trade with Russia. This should be a precedent for sanctions pressure that will work convincingly for the decades to come.
At the moment, Becky, a lot of those things are sort of talked about but not realistic. Finally, though, one of the things I think he's going to have to face is what's now being talked about here as a danger. People are not saying it's happening, but people in Davos are saying there is always the danger of war fatigue. What happens after the summer when the war is still ongoing, inflation is really taking a toll, higher interest rates are slowing the economy, and people are starting to say, well, what is Russia's price for bringing this to an end? We're not there yet, but I can certainly see that that is something on the agenda.
Right, and perhaps the German economic minister's warning of a global recession front and centre in many people's minds at this point, of course. I just wonder, you know, it's not just the German economy minister who is likely to suggest that that is on the horizon. I wonder what the mood is like where you are amongst those who are attending, and whether you think that's a foregone conclusion, or at this point whether the world can avoid it.
The mood here is the most serious that I can ever recall Davos being. You haven't got the frippery, you haven't got the nonsense, a lot of the crypto stuff and all the people about this, that and the other. You haven't got the hangers-on. You've got the policymakers, you've got the CEOs. Everybody is absolutely, it's Ukraine, it's food security, it's energy costs, it's renewables, it's sustainable, it's climate change. There is a seriousness on the agenda that I cannot recall before. And on the question of recession, you know, people will say we can avoid recession. They do not want to answer the question, will we avoid it?
Yeah, fascinating. Listen, good to have you there. We'll check in with you as we move through the week. Thank you, Richard. Still to come on Connect the World. Policy shift or presidential mistake? Many, even in his own administration, are surprised at Joe Biden's comments today about Taiwan. And the ball is in North Korea's court. The view of South Korea's new president talking exclusively to CNN. His view of Pyongyang and its 15 missile tests this year. That is just ahead. US President Joe Biden raised some eyebrows earlier today with some comments, or a comment at least, about Taiwan. During a news conference in Tokyo, Mr. Biden said the US would get involved militarily if China invades Taiwan. The US has long been non-committal about defending Taiwan, an island nation that China considers its own. His aides were said to be surprised by the president's statement, and the White House says the US has not changed its policy on Taiwan. Well, CNN White House correspondent Jeremy Diamond is travelling with the president. He joins us live from Tokyo. Administration officials downplaying the president's statement, claiming it's not a policy shift. This isn't the first time they've had to do that with this president. What's going on here? Is the US trying to get a message to China here, or is this genuinely something the administration was left flat-footed by?
Yeah, I think the key point is the one that you just made there, Becky, which is the fact that this is not the first time that we have heard President Biden make this kind of statement. In fact, it is the third time that President Biden has now suggested that the United States would intervene militarily should China move to invade Taiwan. And that would be a change of decades of U.S. foreign policy, this policy of strategic ambiguity, which essentially leaves up doesn't say definitively whether or not the U.S. would commit troops and intervene militarily should China move forward with an invasion. Now, as you mentioned, senior administration officials were indeed caught off guard by President Biden's comments. And following those comments, we heard from a senior administration official who insisted that, quote, as the president said, our policy has not changed, and also noting that the president reiterated the one China policy. While the president did indeed reiterate that one China policy, he did not he did not say that our policy has not changed. In fact, he did appear to change that policy, but again, officials insisting that the policy is the same, strategic ambiguity remains, but again, that stands in contrast to the president's words.
Looms large over everything Mr. Biden, it seems, is doing on this Asian trip. He's even laid out an economic plan for countering China's influence. What have we got?
Yeah, this is a significant economic framework that the Biden administration unveiled earlier today. President Biden, alongside 12 other signatory countries, launching this Indo-Pacific economic framework. Now, the goal of this framework, of course, is to counter China's growing influence in the region, its economic dominance over the last several years, particularly since the United States withdrew under President Trump from the Trans-Pacific Partnership back in 2017. But there are a ton of key differences between this Indo-Pacific economic framework and the TPP. The first among which is that this economic framework does not involve the lowering of any tariffs or market entry barriers. And instead, it allows countries to essentially pick and choose different areas of this framework where they would like to make commitments. It's not just trade, it also involves climate change policy, anti-corruption efforts, and more. And again, Biden administration officials insisting that this can be game-changing in the region, but some experts questioning whether or not this framework has enough teeth.
Yeah, fascinating. Jeremy, always a pleasure. Thank you very much indeed. South Korea's new president has been in office for only about 2 weeks, yet he has already met with the US president as Joe Biden tours Asia. President Yoon Suk-yeol spoke exclusively to CNN's Paula Hancock's first interview since his inauguration, and he signalled that the age of appeasing North Korea is over. CNN's Paula Hancock's is in Seoul for us, and she joins us now live. A message then to Pyongyang. Just explain what you were told.
Well, Becky, he may only be 2 weeks into his job, but President Yoon Suk-yeol does already place his mark on a North Korean policy. He effectively said that his predecessor's approach to North Korea has failed, and so he is starting a new approach, a new policy, effectively saying that if Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader, wants to start dialogue, then he should initiate it. But of course, it is a big if. South Korea's new president, Yoon Suk-yeol, sets up a new sign for his desk. A gift from US President Joe Biden, who was just in Seoul. A popular quote from the late US President Harry Truman. A former prosecutor just 2 weeks into his presidency and fresh from a summit with Biden. Yoon is now dealing with a North Korea expected to launch a long-range missile or conduct an underground nuclear test any day.
Our response would be stronger and firmer than it has been before. We will coordinate closely with our U.S. counterparts.
But in Kim Jong-un, you have a leader who's given a 5-year plan of what he wants to achieve militarily. He seems to have no interest in talking whatsoever. How do you convince him to talk?
I think the ball is in Chairman Kim's court. It is his choice to start a dialogue with us. I do not want North Korea to collapse. My hope is for North Korea to prosper alongside South Korea.
At the same time, Yoon says he believes his predecessor's policy of prioritizing dialogue with North Korea has failed.
Just to temporarily escape North Korean provocation or conflict is not something that we should do. Many call it servile diplomacy, but the policy of being over-concerned about the other side's feelings does not work and has proven to be a failure in the past 5 years.
South Korea is one of 13 nations President Biden announced today as joining his new Indo-Pacific economic framework, already criticized by China, South Korea's largest trading partner.
Even if we strengthen our alliance with the United States in security and technology, it does not mean that we think our economic cooperation with China is unimportant. So I do not believe it is reasonable for China to be overly sensitive about this matter.
President Yoon says he believes China should abide by the rules-based international order. At a time when that order is under pressure around the world, South Korea's president is clear that his country's future, at least for the next 5 years, is firmly by the side of the United States. And when it comes to him discussing with President Biden expanding possibly the joint military drills, which have been either curtailed or cancelled in recent years from COVID and also from the former US President Donald Trump, we know for a fact and from experience that these expanded drills will anger Pyongyang. And yet when I asked President Yoon about this, he pointed out that every military in the world has to have a state of readiness. So it is necessary to have these expanded joint military drills, something we know that will provoke a response from Pyongyang. Becky?
Seoul's relations with Beijing have become somewhat strained in recent years. What's the new South Korean president's take on Beijing, Paula?
It's an interesting question, Becky, because I asked him directly what his changed relationship is going to be. He denied it was a changed relationship, but it is clear that he is far more direct with Beijing. The fact that he has joined this the Asian economic framework that President Biden has brought about, the fact that that is a counter, effectively, an economic counter to China. And also he said that he wants to be part of some of the working groups within Quad that is widely seen as a strategic counter to China. So he is actively joining groups that he knows could irritate Beijing, and yet he is not shying away from it. Now, he also said that he believed this may have been his predecessor's feelings as well, but they weren't quite so open with what they were doing. But he did say that it's not in China's interest to have any kind of economic retaliation against South Korea, but there is a precedent for that. Remember just several years ago when South Korea introduced the THAAD missile defense system from the US into South Korea, China was so incensed by that they staged a crippling economic boycott against South Korea, which lasted a fair while and damaged many businesses. So it is a real concern that some have, that there could be some kind of economic backlash from China, which is still South Korea's biggest trading partner. But when asked repeatedly about this, President Yoon said that he was not concerned and he did not believe that it would happen. Becky?
Paula Hancock's with the interview. Thank you. Well, the Biden administration's veritable love-in with South Korea and Japan marks a policy shift to the Asia-Pacific, especially after last year's US exodus from Afghanistan. And that is Pakistan's former Prime Minister somewhat scratching his head.
Becky,
I had perfectly good relationship with the Trump administration. It's only when the Biden administration came, and it coincided with what was happening in Afghanistan. And for some reason, which I still don't know, they never got in touch with me.
Well, Imran Khan's been telling me why he alleges that the US played a part in ousting him from power in April. You can hear that interview in the next hour of Connect the World. Well, still to come, monkeypox spreads even further in Europe as another country reports its first known case at least, of the rare virus. I'll speak to our senior medical correspondent about that. Stay with us. Welcome back. I'm Becky Anderson in London. You're watching Connect the World. A new plea to world leaders from Ukraine's president. Volodymyr Zelensky made a remote appearance at the economic summit in Davos in Switzerland. He asked for more weapons and tougher sanctions on Russia, including an end to all trade with Moscow. And the first Russian soldier accused of war crimes in Ukraine has been found guilty. A court in Kyiv sentenced him to life in prison for killing an unarmed civilian. He may appeal the sentence within 30 days. Russia's invasion of Ukraine inspired Finland and Sweden to forego decades of military neutrality and apply for NATO membership. Now, both nations, of course, have significant fighting forces. CNN's Nina Dos Santos shows us what Sweden has to offer the Western alliance. Have a look at this.
Sweden's armed forces holding joint exercises with Finland days after the countries applied to join NATO. These drills were planned 2 years ago, but have taken on a new urgency since Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
The opponent have shown very clearly that the threshold to use their military means to reach their aims and goals have lowered. We don't exclude anything today.
With well-funded defences, both countries bring a lot to the table. Sweden, in particular, with its own homemade high-tech hardware, originally set up to support the nation's neutrality.
So basically it's the fighter jets and then the submarines.
Yeah, I think Sweden has four main contributions. I mean, the first one being geography. NATO cannot fulfill Article 5 scenario in the Baltics without using Swedish territory. Secondly is the Swedish Air Force, with the third one being deep intelligence cooperation, and the fourth one being the submarine force.
If part of NATO, Sweden's submarines and fighter jets could play a greater role in protecting Scandinavia and the Baltic Sea.
Without an air defense, it will be very difficult for the Army and the Navy to conduct their operations. We are a strong air force with 100 fighters. We will add strength to the NATO.
The jewel in its crown, the Gripen Jazz 39, made by Saab.
What's it feel like?
Being in this aircraft is like being inside a rocket. You fly a thing like this in that speed. It's absolutely amazing. Using our avionics system is a completely new way of managing information. All these sensors give you lots of information.
I have been given the chance to take a look inside the cockpit. And what I can tell you is that you're immediately struck by the sheer amount of technology that's been packed into a very tight space.
Already used by NATO members Hungary and the Czech Republic, these sophisticated craft have earned Sweden, home to just over 10 million people, a place among the top-ranked air forces.
These Swedish jets are also designed to be able to take off and land from very short runways. For instance, here they've been practicing on a local highway. They also only need a limited number of personnel to refuel and rearm them, and that can be done within 10 to 12 minutes.
If you have one or two air bases, I mean, those will be targets immediately. If you have that capability that you can use highways and hide the aircrafts and the operations, you become sort of much less a target.
Sweden's bid for NATO membership may have hit some unexpected turbulence, but having these capabilities could, in the end, help to win critics over.
We bring knowledge and experience from this region. We live here, we exercise here, we are prepared to fight here.
Nina Dos Santos, CNN, in Thun, Sweden.
Well, let's get you up to speed on some of the other stories that are on our radar right now. And the US has received its first overseas shipment of baby formula to address what is a nationwide shortage. A US military aircraft from Germany carrying 35 tons of baby formula arrived in Indianapolis on Sunday. It's expected to provide a week's worth of hypoallergenic formula to 27,000 babies and toddlers in critical need. Denmark reporting its first monkeypox infection. The Danish Health Ministry says a man tested positive for monkeypox after a trip to Spain and is now in isolation. More cases have also been detected in Portugal as the number worldwide passes 100. CNN senior medical correspondent Elizabeth Cohen here in London with me, I'm delighted to say, to talk about both of these stories. But I want to start off with this evolving story of monkeypox, which I have to say I think has caught, to a certain extent, so many people off guard. What do we know at this point?
As a public health official said to me, it wasn't on my bingo card. You know, who thought the monkeypox was going to show up? So what's being done is isolating the person who's sick and then contact tracing with the people they had contact with. And I know you might be rolling your eyes right now because that's what they did during COVID, and we saw how well that worked. Not well, it just ran out of control. I will explain in a minute why it will work better with monkeypox, or at least it should work better. So first, let's take a look at where monkeypox is. As Becky said, more than 100 cases in 15 countries. When you take a look at the list, it's basically Europe, Australia, the United States. The United States now has at least 3 cases that are either confirmed or presumptive. And so if we take a look at the symptoms, you can see that it starts out looking like a whole bunch of other things, but then it becomes a rash, and the transmission is by prolonged face-to-face contact. And I want to emphasize that it's prolonged. It is not like COVID or contact with bodily fluids. And it was first discovered many years ago in research monkeys. Now I want to explain to you why this isolation and contact tracing should help. It's just harder to spread monkeypox. So, for example, if you and I sitting here right now, if one of us had COVID, this new, the Omicron version of it, it's pretty likely the other one would get COVID. It's just that transmissible. That's not the case with monkeypox. It needs to be more prolonged. It needs to be closer, especially if you're getting that skin-to-skin contact with those lesions, that will spread it. So if you can isolate the cases and then tell their contacts, look, you need to be, quarantined and you need to be watching for these symptoms, that can go a long way.
That's fascinating. Let's talk about baby formula and this crisis in the US. It is so rare to see pallets of baby formula arriving from Germany to help American families. What's the latest on all of this?
I have to say, I just came back from Ramstein. I was there, over the weekend. And there was this sense, as an American, of pride that the American military was helping get this formula from Europe to the U.S. And the service members certainly felt that as well. But it was bittersweet. There is a bitterness that Europeans need to help Americans feed their own babies. And this all started because there was a supply chain shortage of some of the ingredients that were needed for formula back at the end of last year. And then one of the major factories making baby formula in the United States got closed because they had a problem with contamination. Now, there's only 2 big companies in the U.S. that make most of the baby formula in the U.S., and so it's when one of them has to shutter one of their major plants that really is a problem. So let's take a look at Operation Fly Formula. That's the images that you're seeing there, where they went from, the packages went from Ramstein to Indiana. So in between that flight and another one that's coming up this week, it's 1.5 million ounces, 1.5 million bottles, each bottle 8 ounces, the equivalent of that in 2 flights. The first one landed in Indianapolis yesterday, and that one is not going to supermarket shelves. It's going to hospitals, it's going to pharmacies. It's hypoallergenic, it's for babies with allergies. The second one is expected in the coming days. It will also be hyperallergenic formula. It is unclear where that's going to go. And I think this is really key, Becky, because American parents are seeing this video and are expecting to show up at their local supermarket and see full shelves. That's not the case, because the ones that were delivered yesterday are not even going to supermarkets. We don't know about this next batch. But even if this next batch does go to supermarkets, it's still a relatively small amount in a gigantic country.
Pleasure having you here.
It's great to be here.
Thank you very much indeed. Right, still to come, blue is the happiest of colours. And if you don't believe me, just ask Manchester City fans. They painted the town blue last night. And we head back into the courtroom for the final few days of that trial pitting Hollywood star against Hollywood star. Today, a surgeon's testimony raises questions about some of Johnny Depp's injuries. All that coming up after this. Right, welcome back. The defamation trial pitting actor Johnny Depp against Amber Heard has now resumed. It's expected to be the final week of testimony, and Depp is expected to be called back to the stand. So far this morning, we've been hearing testimony from an orthopaedic surgeon. Jean Cazares has been following the trial. There's talk that Amber Heard's lawyers could call Johnny Depp back to the stand. This is as a rebuttal witness. As I understand, this is a really unusual move for the defence. Just talk us through this.
Okay, well, first of all, this is Amber Heard's case. So they are finishing up their case. And we can talk about Johnny Depp in a second because they have the right to call him to the stand in their case in chief. Because remember, she's countersuing, right, for defamation because of the Daily Mail articles in 2020 that said that Amber Heard was a fraud. But today, it's very interesting. Orthopedic surgeon took the stand for Amber Heard, saying that in regard to that severed finger in Australia, that Johnny Depp's testimony was that his hand was on the bar and she threw a vodka bottle and it crashed, cut open, splintered open, the bottle broke, and it severed his finger. He said if that's how it happened, that his nail would have been busted and different parts of the finger would have been fractured. And he looked at the x-rays and it wasn't so. So they're discounting his claim. But then on cross-examination, which was very strong, did you look at the witness testimony of the butler who was there? Did you look at the pictures of all the broken vodka bottles underneath the bar right where Depp was sitting? No. Did you look at the severed fingertip that was found underneath the bar? No. So they really worked at discrediting him because Heard's team put him on the stand but didn't show him all the evidence. And as an expert, he can see everything.
It's like a game of Cluedo, this one. I mean, I say that lightly. Anyway, we'll continue to watch this. Jean, thank you. Well, there were so many tears at the Etihad Stadium last night. These, though, were tears of joy. Man City made a huge comeback in the English Premier League and left their manager, Pep Guardiola, almost speechless. Almost, but not quite. World Sport anchor Christina McFarlane knows what I'm talking about.
He really wasn't that speechless. We heard in the press conference afterwards that he even had time to joke that he'd been given some advice on comebacks by Real Madrid.
Wow.
Of course, pretty funny under the circumstances. But, you know, this will go down, Becky, as one of the greatest comebacks in Premier League history. You saw the crowd invade the pitch last night. I know we're waiting for the parade to happen later today in Manchester. Goodness knows what that is going to be like. But, you know, also cements Pep Guardiola as one of the greatest managers of his generation. He's won in Spain, he's won in Germany, and now he has won.
They came back against Aston Villa, and of course they had to win that game because, you know, just behind them, Liverpool, who are still playing Champions League football and could still win the Champions League. And to a certain extent, anybody who's sort of, you know, objective observer here will say they sort of hope they do because they've been nicked, they've been robbed of the league at this point, haven't they?
And Liverpool was saying, you know, this is a bit of a warm-up act for us for the real act next weekend, and you can understand.
It was just a thoroughly good end to the season, which is brilliant. EPL, we love it. Thank you very much indeed. We are going to hand over to World Sport after this short break. I am back after that.
and welcome along to CNN World Sport with me, Christina McFarlane. Pep Guardiola has hailed his side as legends after 5 insane minutes saw Manchester City stage one of the greatest comebacks in Premier League history to secure another title, their 5th in 6 seasons. Pep Guardiola has a truly astonishing day at the Etihad. It was a result that drew inevitable comparisons with another epic comeback just weeks before that. It didn't go City's way, an irony not lost on Pep Guardiola.
I called Real Madrid, they gave me good advice. This was the reason why. Listen, no explanation Madrid, no explanation today. It's momentum, people, and and sometimes it's nice to live, sometimes it's nice to live these kind of situations. You leave it for the future. So I had the feeling that will help us to be stronger next season. Maybe we need a little bit more time, but every second I pass after winning this Premier League, we realize, all of us, 4 Premier Leagues in 5 years in this country, Premier Leagues. It's probably the best achievements we have done in our careers.
He said it. Well, let's bring in my colleague Alex Thomas, who was there to witness the rollercoaster unfold on Sunday and is currently waiting on the victory parade in Manchester. Alex, we saw fans invade the pitch Sunday, unable to contain their emotions. What have Manchester City got in store for those fans tonight?
We can probably see a host of stewards coming past me to get ready for crowd control later when the victory parade starts in just over an hour or so. It's going to start up at the Exchange Square, mile or two that way behind our cameraman, and come down here, Deansgate, a very famous main street in the centre of Manchester, finishing up at the stage behind me. Champions again is the phrase for the night. Their 4th title in 5 years in the Premier League. Only Manchester United have done that in the Premier League era. Only a handful of clubs ever have been English football champions so frequently. So a real dynasty being built here at Manchester City. After a comeback of sorts, they were always expected to beat Aston Villa on the final day of the season, but found themselves 2-0 down against a team managed by former Liverpool legend Steven Gerrard, who looked like he might have helped his old club get the title at the death. But City holding their nerve, fighting back with those 3 goals in 5 minutes. An absolutely astonishing achievement, a decade on from their first Premier League title, only secured by a Sergio Aguero goal deep into added time at the end of the game. 100,000 fans turned out on that occasion. Maybe not quite as many this time, Christina, especially with the typical Manchester weather doing its thing, where you can often get 4 seasons in as many hours any time of the year here.
Yeah, I know that to be true from personal experience, Alex. So let's talk next. What next for Manchester City? Because as you've mentioned, they are already a force to be reckoned with. But they are going to have a significant addition to the lineup next season in the form of Erling Haaland. So surely Champions League, the final, a win in the Champions League has to be next for them.
That will definitely be talked about, and who would bet against Erling Haaland taking his place alongside the players at this time next year with maybe another Premier League trophy or perhaps more? Who knows? Certainly the focus is on City winning the Champions League because it's a goal of the new owners that took over in 2008 and have overseen this unprecedented era of success for the team with 14 major trophies in as many years. I think the City boss Pep Guardiola would say, look, yes, the Champions League is a focus, but so is every competition we enter. And for him, he's the specialist now in league titles. 10 in 13 years in 3 different countries, Spain, Germany and England. He's building a dynasty here at City the way Manchester United did under Alex Ferguson. The only difference being that Pep's unlikely to be here for 20 plus years the way Fergie was. If I was a bit higher, Christina, we could see over the backdrop to the stage behind me, you'd actually be able to glimpse United's ground, Old Trafford. This is where they would hold their trophy celebrations year in, year out. These days, it tends to be the blue half of Manchester instead.
Well, good luck with the crowd control tonight, Alex. I think you're going to need it, and enjoy the party. OK, we are hearing from the PGA champion next, who staged a comeback of his own on Sunday.
I appreciate anybody who backed me today.
Apparently it was 1.2%.
Really?
Apparently, that's what I heard.
I mean, that's probably 1.2% more than I would have taken.
We're back with tennis now, and Barbara Krejcikova's French Open title defence ended a short time ago. The Czech losing to unseeded Diane Parry in 3 sets. Krejcikova was playing her first match since Doha in February after retiring from an elbow injury. And also, Naomi Osaka is out, losing in straight sets to USA's Amanda Anisimova in her opening round. Osaka has not had the best preparation for Roland Garros, withdrawing from Rome earlier this month with a lingering Achilles injury. She admitted this week that she had felt some concern about returning to Paris after withdrawing last year over mental health concerns, but had attended all press conferences scheduled so far. Meanwhile, no slip-ups for the top seed and favourite Iga Świątek, who sailed through her opening round over Ukraine's Lesia Sorenko in straight sets. That, of course, extending her winning streak to 29 in a row now as she looks to recapture a French Open title. And a reminder, on this blockbuster Monday at Roland Garros, that 13-time champion Rafa Nadal is currently in action, and up later, Novak Djokovic is still to come. Now, Sunday was certainly the day for dramatic finales as former world number 1 Justin Thomas overturned a 7-shot deficit to win the PGA Championship, equaling the biggest comeback in the tournament's history. Barely in the mix heading into the final round, all eyes were instead on Chile's Mito Pereira, who looked pretty set to win his first major before double bogeying the 18th. That opened the door to Thomas and Will Zalatoris to play off for the title. Thomas's experience coming to the fore when it mattered with a decisive birdie on 17 to claim his second PGA Championship. After the victory, he spoke to our Don Riddell.
It's a lot. I don't think it's really set in. I know all the emotions and excitement, I think, has definitely hit me in terms of crashing. I'm very tired and worn out, but I'm very excited, and everybody on my whole team has really put in a lot of hard work and effort for this moment to be here, and I can't thank them all enough.
When you teed off, you were 7 strokes behind the leader. Do you have any idea what odds the professionals gave you, the Stato guys? Have you heard?
I haven't, but I appreciate anybody who backed me today.
Apparently it was 1.2%.
Really?
Apparently, that's what I heard.
I mean, that's probably 1.2% more than I would have taken. I mean, when you're that far behind, you can't, in a major, you can't do it all yourself. You need some help, and I understood that it was going to be tough for those guys, just as it was and is for me to try to win the tournament. And yeah, I just executed when I needed to, and it was just enough.
When you won your first major, and you did this the first time in 2017, honestly, how hard did you think it would be to do it again?
I mean, when it happens, you think it's going to happen the next time you play. It really do. I think it's one of those things. When things are going well, especially in the sport, it's easy. It's the ball bounces the right way, the putts slip in. Just guys do what you need them to do in the leaderboard. Like, stuff just happens. But when it's not going well is when you have no idea if and when it's going to happen again. And over 5 years, I've definitely had a lot of those moments. But I'm just very, very glad to be back here now.
Well, now that you've got this second one under your belt, how do you recalibrate your expectations for this next phase of your career?
I don't think you change them. I mean, I think that's the biggest thing for me is just not. I mean, obviously, I know and think that if I play well, I should and could have a chance to win, but I can't necessarily go in saying I expect to win, because it's just, I just have to take it for what it is. I mean, there's so much that can happen over the course of 9 holes, let alone 4 rounds, that I can't get ahead of myself, and I have to be a little bit more process and specific hole and shot oriented as opposed to the entire week oriented, because if I do the things I'm supposed to do as the week goes on, then I could be sitting here more often, and that's the hope.
Great to hear the thoughts of Justin Thomas, and that will do it for this edition of World Sport. But before we go, here's one more look at Thomas's second career major triumph in our Rolex Minute.
CNN London, this is Connect the World with Becky Anderson.
This hour, a Russian soldier has been sentenced to life in prison for killing an unarmed man in Ukraine's first war crimes trial since the invasion by Russia began. More on that in a moment. But first, I want to take you to Asia, where US President Joe Biden currently is, and for my exclusive interview with Pakistan's former Prime Minister Imran Khan. I'm Becky Anderson. Hello and welcome back to Connect the World. US President Joe Biden causing whiplash today over his comments on defending Taiwan. More on that in a moment. But first to Pakistan, where the former Prime Minister is claiming once again that the Biden administration is the root of his political problems. Imran Khan continues to tout an unsubstantiated claim that an American-led conspiracy is the reason he was ousted from power last month. Khan was removed by a no-confidence vote over allegations of economic mismanagement, with the country facing depleting foreign exchange reserves and skyrocketing inflation. Shehbaz Sharif, whose family dynasty is no stranger to scandal itself, now leads the country until the next general election, which is expected in 2023. However, Imran Khan is calling for early elections and for the nation to follow him on a, quote, long march on Islamabad just 2 days from now. He says this march is not about politics, but is a revolution. Pakistan's information minister says Khan is showing his desperation at the expense of the country. Well, in his first interview with international media since being removed from power, he tells me, that is Imran Khan, how he believes the United States interfered to have him ousted.
On the 7th of March, Becky, Under Secretary of State in the US, who's responsible for South Asia, he calls our ambassador, a meeting between our ambassador in Washington. He tells our ambassador, in an official meeting, there are note takers on both sides. He tells the ambassador that unless you get rid of your Prime Minister Imran Khan in a vote of no confidence, which, by the way, hadn't been tabled as yet, but he seemed to know about it, he said, unless you get rid of him, Pakistan will suffer consequences. And then goes on to say, of course, if you get rid of him through the vote of no confidence, all will be forgiven. Such arrogance, apart from anything else. By the way, Becky, this guy should be sacked for bad manners and sheer arrogance. Imagine telling a country, an ambassador of a country of 220 million people that you get rid of your prime minister. So this is where it started. The next day, this vote of no confidence is tabled in our parliament.
Imran
and then
Khan,
follows...
why have you never made this public before? You are being very specific about what you allege was said.
Well, Becky, I put it in front of our cabinet. The cipher was read out in the cabinet. There are minutes of the cabinet. Then I presented it in our National Security Council, where all the service chiefs were present. Why did I present them? Because this was a blatant intervention in the internal affairs of Pakistan, a regime change.
As Prime Minister at the time, did you get in touch with the US President, with the US Secretary of State? What happened?
The National Security Council decided to give a démarche, protested to the US in Pakistan and in Washington. We issued it. This is all minuted. Then we presented it to the Parliament Committee, then the Speaker of Parliament, then the President of Pakistan, who has this cipher, he sent it to the Chief Justice of Pakistan that there should be an inquiry held in this blatant interference in the internal affairs of Pakistan.
Pakistan's new foreign minister says the United States and his country are entering a new engagement after what has been years of strained relations. And you and I have talked about those strained relations under your premiership. Do you believe, for the sake of Pakistan, that it is better to have a good relationship with the United States?
Becky, I had perfectly good relationship with the Trump administration. It's only when the Biden administration came and it coincided with what was happening in Afghanistan. And for some reason, which I still don't know, they never got in touch with me. There was no US ambassador to Pakistan. I have no idea. But look, my point is very simple. 220 million people of Pakistan elected me. My first responsibility is to the people of Pakistan. My responsibility is for the well-being. We have 50 million people living below the poverty line. So when Russia offers us 30% discount on oil and 30% discount on wheat imports, India does the same. India is part of the Quad, part of the strategic alliance with the US. India imports oil from the US, but for some reason, this was taken against me, as if I was being anti-US or anti-American.
The US, let me repeat, has rubbished the notion that they have been involved in regime change in Pakistan. You continue to assert what they suggest is a conspiracy theory here. Do you genuinely believe that the US has been behind a regime change in Pakistan?
Before this happened, before this meeting with Donald Lu and our ambassador, the US embassy was calling members of my party who were some of the backbenchers who were not happy. They were having meetings with the US embassy. What were they meeting them? And they were the first ones who then jumped ship. And they were the ones who then offered $1 million each to buy my other members of parliament who actually jumped ship later on. Why would the US embassy be interested in backbenchers of our party?
So is the current government an American implant?
It's with their blessings. And, you know, the painful thing, Becky, is not just that we all call it imported government. But the worst thing is, they're a bunch of criminals. For 30 years, these guys have been plundering the country. 60% of the cabinet is on bail.
You were in Russia meeting President Putin the day he announced the war in Ukraine. The optics didn't and don't look good, do they?
They didn't, Becky, but let me explain to you, this visit was planned a long time back, and all the stakeholders in Pakistan were on board. The military wanted hardware from the Russians. We wanted oil. There was a gas pipeline which was being negotiated for the past 6 years before my government came in. So this trip was planned a long time before. How would I know that the day I land in Moscow, President Putin decides to go into Ukraine? I wasn't supposed to know that.
Do you regret that trip now?
I would regret if we had known about the invasion and then I had gone in, I guess I would have regretted it, because I do not believe in military solutions. I have opposed all military ways of achieving political ends. But I wasn't supposed to know.
Imran Khan, will you run again? Will you run again as Prime Minister in the next elections?
Whenever the next elections take place, not only will we run, but I can predict right now that this will become the biggest party in Pakistan's history, because people are so incensed and feel insulted that these criminals have been foisted upon us, who have been plundering this country for 30 years. There is anger in Pakistan. And unfortunately, because of all this becoming public, the cipher, Donald Ru's comments, who should be sacked for bad manners, there's anti-Americanism. Because you know that so many regime changes, whether US, like in Iran, Prime Minister Mossadegh, like in South American countries, when unpopular governments are foisted on a people, the resentment then goes against the US. And unfortunately, yes, there is anti-Americanism right now.
Well, that's Imran Khan in his first interview with international media since his ousting. We have reached out to the US State Department today following my interview. They again denied the allegations by saying there is absolutely no truth to them. And on April the 4th, the State Department said, and I quote, "We support the peaceful upholding of constitutional democratic principles. That is the case in Pakistan. It is the case around the world. We do not support one political party over another. We support the broader principles, the principles of rule of law, of equal justice under the law." And we also reached out to Pakistan's current government, but we have not heard back yet. But on April the 27th, Pakistan's information minister said, and I quote him here, "People of Pakistan are questioning Imran over his false corruption narrative. They are asking him why did he not prove any corruption with all his abuse of powers for 4 years." And apologies for the technical glitch there as we were wanting to bring that up, that statement for you on the screen. Well, moving on to Ukraine, and a first since Russia's invasion. A court in Kyiv found a Russian soldier guilty of war crimes in the first such trial since Russia invaded nearly 3 months ago. The 21-year-old was sentenced to life in prison for shooting and killing an unarmed civilian. He has 30 days to appeal. Meantime, Ukraine's president met virtually with world economic leaders gathered in Davos, Switzerland today. Volodymyr Zelensky says up to 100 people are dying every day defending eastern Ukraine. And he urged nations to send more weapons and to maximize sanctions on Russia.
Не чекайте рокових пострілів, не чекайте застосування Росією.
Do not wait for fatal shots. Do not wait for Russia to use special chemical and biological and, God forbid, nuclear weapons. Do not create an image in the aggressor's mind that the world won't repel enough. You need to straight away apply maximum effort to protect the freedom and the normal, beneficial for everyone in the world. This is what sanctions should be, maximum, in order for Russia or any other potential aggressor who wants to wage war on its neighbour to know straight away what the result will be.
Well, CNN's Melissa Bell joins live from Kyiv today. Let's start with the guilty verdict and life sentence for this Russian soldier. As I understand it, this is, or potentially is, just the first of many such trials, correct?
We've just been speaking, in fact, Becky, we've just come from an interview with Ukraine's chief prosecutor, who said that she was satisfied with the way due process had been respected in this court ruling, but there were 13,000 more recorded war crimes for Ukraine's judiciary to get through. And for now, it's just not going to have the number of prosecutors it needs to do that. But she is very satisfied that it has been able to get to the end of this verdict in the first trial because there are, she says, so many more to come. Bear in mind, Becky, also that the point of this process was to begin bringing justice for this unarmed civilian who was killed on the 4th day of the war by Vadim Shishimarin, who had admitted his guilt from the outset, but had defended himself by saying that he'd been following orders. Bear in mind that this trial happens as the war rages in the east of the country, but elsewhere as well. And even as those 100 lives are being lost, according to President Zelensky, every day on the front lines of Ukraine, this was an important message as well, said the prosecutor, speaking just after the sentence was handed down, to those Russian soldiers still fighting in Ukraine. Have a listen.
Я думаю, що можливо це та стежина, яку ми протоптали, і по ній далі.
I think that all other law enforcement agencies will move along the path we have travelled. This will be a good example for other occupiers who may not yet be on our territory but are planning to come, or those who are here now and plan to stay and fight. Or maybe they will think that it's time to leave here for their own territory.
Now, it's important to remember that this is a civilian court. Judging and, in the end, ruling and carrying out this sentence, announcing the sentence, handing down this verdict, rather, Becky, on Vadim Shishimarin with regard to a particular article of Ukrainian law, and that is that he was found guilty of premeditated murder in violation of the customs and rules of war.
But this was a civilian tribunal. It is not a war crimes tribunal. And the evidence that is being gathered right now here in Ukraine, there's 13,000 war crimes that have been documented by Ukrainian authorities. They say they are looking forward to the ICC being able to have a look at, because it is only the international courts that have the jurisdictions and the ability to look at crimes like crimes against humanity, the legality or not of this invasion to begin with. And they believe that by collecting, with the help of all the international forensic teams here on the ground, looking at the specific details of what they can record about the specific war crimes that are alleged to have been committed, that this will then help international justice to do its job, Becky.
Melissa Bell is in Kyiv for you. Thank you. You're watching Connect World with me, Becky Anderson, live today from London for you. Still ahead, the harrowing wait for information for a wife whose husband surrendered to Russian forces at the Azovstal steel plant in Mariupol. And Joe Biden went to Asia to talk about countering China's economic might, but he had another warning for Beijing. Details of his controversial statement in just a moment. Joe Biden's visit to Tokyo on Monday went as expected, except for one surprise. As expected, Mr. Biden got Japan to sign on to a new trade agreement that seeks to blunt China's influence in Asia. But Mr. Biden also raised eyebrows by signalling that the US would get involved militarily if China invades Taiwan. Have a listen.
You didn't want to get involved in the Ukraine conflict militarily for obvious reasons. Are you willing to get involved militarily to defend Taiwan if it comes to that?
Yes.
You are?
That's the commitment we made. We agree with a one China policy. We signed on to it and all the attendant agreements made from there. But the idea that it can be taken by force, just taken by force, is just not appropriate.
Well, US officials were said to be surprised by the president's statement, and the White House says the US has not changed its policy on Taiwan. CNN White House correspondent Jeremy Diamond travelling with the president. He joins us live from Tokyo. Not the first time that Biden, or at least we are told that the US President Joe Biden has slipped his words, as it were. Jeremy, your sense?
Yeah, that's right. And I think it's notable that this walk back that we got from a White House official just moments after the president made those comments, it's the same statement that they've issued twice before when President Biden has also put into question this policy of strategic ambiguity. A White House official saying, quote, "Our policy has not changed," and insisting that the president said something to that effect. But in fact, if you listen to the president's words, as we just heard them in that clip that you played, the president is pretty unambiguous, without caveat, saying that the U.S. Would intervene militarily should China move to invade Taiwan. Yes, he also says that the U.S. still stands by its one China policy, whereby it acknowledges China's claim to Taiwan, but does not officially accept it nor endorse that position, and still maintains, of course, those unofficial diplomatic relations with Taiwan. But again, the fact that the president has done this not once, twice, but now 3 times, and this time, frankly, in the most forceful way possible, really does suggest a change in U.S. policy, despite what the White House is now saying. Of course, China, we saw forcefully condemning these words, but it is notable, of course, to see how the president is defining them now, suggesting that he would intervene militarily. Becky?
Is his China policy on this trip across the board becoming clearer?
Well, I think that obviously you have the national security and the economic dynamics to this trip. On the economic front, the president's Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is that attempt by President Biden to do what he has talked about since coming into office, which is to say that the U.S. Wants competition, economic competition with China, but not confrontation. And in this way, he hopes that this new framework will help the U.S. reassert its economic influence over the Indo-Pacific, push back on China's growing economic dominance in the region. But it is notable that it is not as strong as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which President Trump pulled out of. Now, on the national security front, we've heard President Biden repeatedly emphasizing on this trip the importance of free maritime travel and respect for maritime law in this Indo-Pacific region. He has also talked about respect for the Taiwan Strait. There are a number of disputes over several islands, of course, between China and Japan, for example. But what's been interesting, Becky, is the fact that China has really been the subtext of so much of what President Biden has talked about here. He's made very few explicit mentions of China except when asked in certain questions. It was on that first day where we heard President Biden talk about supply chains. He referenced Russia and Putin, but the subtext of that, again, was China talking about the need for the U.S., South Korea, Japan to work together more closely economically, talking about like-minded countries working together rather than relying on autocracies, again, like China.
Yeah, fascinating. Jeremy, thank you. Well, just days after hosting President Biden in Seoul, South Korea's new president sat down with CNN for his first media interview since taking office earlier this month. Speaking to exclusively to my colleague Paula Hancock's, President Yoon Suk-yeol signalled that the age of appeasing North Korea is over. Paula Hancock's joining us now from the South Korean capital. And just explain how significant this narrative pivot is by the new president.
Well, Becky, President Yoon Suk-yeol may only be 2 weeks into the job, but he is definitely putting his mark on North Korean policy. Now, he has said that he believes that his predecessor's approach towards North Korea has failed. And he also has pointed out that he believes if Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader, wants to start dialogue, then he has to be the one to initiate it. But of course, it is a very big if. South Korea's new president, Yoon Suk-yeol, sets up a new sign for his desk. A gift from US President Joe Biden, who was just in Seoul. A popular quote from the late US President Harry Truman. A former prosecutor just 2 weeks into his presidency and fresh from a summit with Biden. Yoon is now dealing with a North Korea expected to launch a long-range missile or conduct an underground nuclear test any day.
Our response will be stronger and firmer than it has been before. We will coordinate closely with our U.S. counterparts.
But in Kim Jong-un, you have a leader who's given a 5-year plan of what he wants to achieve militarily. He seems to have no interest in talking whatsoever. How do you convince him to talk?
I think the ball is in Chairman Kim's court. It is his choice to start a dialogue with us. I do not want North Korea to collapse. My hope is for North Korea to prosper alongside South Korea.
At the same time, Yoon says he believes his predecessor's policy of prioritizing dialogue with North Korea has failed.
Just to temporarily escape North Korean provocation or conflict is not something that we should do. Many call it servile diplomacy, but the policy of being over-concerned about the other side's feelings does not work and has proven to be a failure in the past 5 years.
South Korea is one of 13 nations President Biden announced today as joining his new Indo-Pacific economic framework, already criticized by China, South Korea's largest trading partner.
Even if we strengthen our alliance with the United States in security and technology, it does not mean that we think our economic cooperation with China is unimportant. So I do not believe it is reasonable for China to be overly sensitive about this matter.
President Yoon says he believes China should abide by the rules-based international order. At a time when that order is under pressure around the world, South Korea's president is clear that his country's future, at least for the next 5 years, is firmly by the side of the United States. Now, when it comes to President Yoon's decision and agreement with President Biden that they may expand the joint military drills between their two militaries, we do know from experience that this will anger Pyongyang. I asked him about this and whether he worried this would anger Pyongyang, to which President Yoon simply replied that militaries around the world need to be in a state of readiness, and the US and South Korean alliance is no different. Becky?
Paula Hancock's with the interview and on the story for you. Paula, thank you. Still ahead on Connect the World, a sentence is announced in a landmark legal case in Ukraine. The prison time now facing a Russian soldier who pleaded guilty to war crimes. And face coverings remain a point of contention in Afghanistan. A show of support at Afghan news channel Tolu News. A Ukrainian court has sentenced a Russian soldier to life in prison in Ukraine's first war crimes trial since the start of the Russian invasion. 21-year-old, seen here on the right, pleading guilty to killing an unarmed Ukrainian civilian in the early days of the war. Well, Ukrainian soldiers have left the Azov steel plant in Mariupol, and they will reportedly face their own trials. The pro-Russian separatist leader of Donetsk telling Russian state media the documents for tribunals are now being prepared, and there's also talk of a possible prisoner exchange coming from the Russian Foreign Ministry. Well, let's pick this apart somewhat. I want to bring in Suzanne Malveaux, connecting us from Lviv in western Ukraine. And as I understand it, you've been speaking to the wife of a soldier who was stuck in that steel plant in Mariupol. What's the family been telling you?
Well, the family is simply waiting at this point. Natalia Zariska essentially is trying to get any kind of glimmer of hope that she can from the statements, and they are conflicting statements, as you had noted. She is hoping that President Zelensky's warning to the Russians that if, in fact, they destroy or ruin the lives of those in Azovstal, that there will be no discussions with the Russians. But, of course, she has no idea whether or not out of those about 2,000 or so the Russians say that are being held in captivity, whether or not her husband, in fact, will be tried and be going through this kind of interrogation process or not. She is trying to remain strong. She says her husband is strong, and she, in the meantime, just has to wait.
As Russia pummeled the Mariupol steel plant with overwhelming firepower, Natalia Zariska could only watch and pray for her husband Bohdan inside. But Bohdan, a Ukrainian soldier, was able to update Natalia almost daily, she says, chronicling the worsening conditions.
He described the situation like the real hell, because people had no legs, no hands, and no medicine.
Weeks in, photos revealed Bohdan was jaundiced and had dropped weight.
He lost weight, approximately 20 kilos. But he has a very strong spirit.
He'd seen many of his friends killed and feared he was next. Following his commander's order, Thursday, Bohdan surrendered, telling Natalia he would lose all ability to communicate. Now, with his fellow soldiers in Russian custody, Natalia can only assume he's at their nearby detention center. Her greatest fear now, that he is being tortured or worse.
We write each message as the last one.
What is the last message that he typed to you?
I love you. He was worried about his mom. He asked me to let her know that he is alive and to wait for him.
Natalia believes Bohdan will give everything to stay alive, motivated by their shared desire to someday create a family.
And this idea helps me to be strong.
But the pain of not knowing is excruciating, the weight heavy, as Russia's attacks carry on.
Natalia says of her husband, she says he is a man of action, and Natalia is taking action herself. She is part of a small group of wives and mothers of those who are being detained by Russian forces, and they are working with Turkish government officials, including the Turkish president, to try to bring awareness and perhaps to try to push some sort of negotiation, some sort of prison swap. But Becky, so far, she does not have any updates about this, and she has not yet heard from her husband.
It's absolutely terrifying, isn't it? Suzanne, CNN has spoken exclusively to a Russian who resigned after objecting to President Putin's invasion of Ukraine. What else do we know about this man?
Well, at this point, we know that he is home, back in Russia with his family, but his fate is certainly uncertain, actually, because he doesn't really know what will happen next. But he did tell his story, and it was anonymously. It was February 22nd. That's when we saw that huge buildup on the Ukrainian border of the Russian troops. He said at that point he was ordered, along with his fellow officers, comrades, if you will, to turn over their cell phones. That is when he lost communication with the rest of the world. They were also ordered to paint these Z's on their military vehicles. At the time, he was not aware what the meaning was, that a symbol of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And then he says 2 days later, February 24th, he was part of that initial convoy that, in fact, invaded Ukraine. He said he had no idea what this mission was about or the purpose, and that he was not alone, that there were many others with him who did not understand the point, that they had not heard any kind of propaganda or message that had trickled down to them regarding getting rid of Nazis or denazifying Ukrainians as the propaganda had been. And he describes a harrowing experience inside the first couple of days, that, yes, the Ukrainian forces, they were under attack, that he was scared for his life. He thought it was a miracle that they had essentially survived. And just weeks into the war is when things changed for him. He obtained a radio receiver, and that is when he actually got news from the rest of the world saying that, yes, that the economy was collapsing in Russia, and he was filled with guilt, with remorse, that he felt shame even that he was in the Ukrainian people's country. Becky.
Suzanne Malvo is on the ground in Ukraine for you. Suzanne, always a pleasure. Thank you. If you want to read the full piece by CNN's Uliana Pavlova, you can find that at cnn.com. It is, I have to say, a fascinating read. You're watching Connect the World with me, Becky Anderson, live from London today. Ahead, documenting history in Afghanistan. A photojournalist wins a Pulitzer Prize for his images of the fall of Kabul. A show of solidarity at Afghan news channel Tolo News. Now, on Sunday, a group of male employees wore masks alongside female anchors who've been ordered by the Taliban to cover their faces. Those anchors are now wearing face coverings on air, and over the weekend, the Taliban once again emphasising that women must follow their order. My colleague CNN's Christiane Amanpour was reporting from Kabul last week when the Taliban's announcement came down, and she met with Tolo's anchors about their fears before that announcement was made. Have a listen to this.
For the past 5 months, Khatira Ahmadi has been anchoring the morning news on Tolo TV. But this might be the last time she can show her face on air. The morning editorial meeting starts with worried discussion about mandatory masking. Station director Kpolwak Sapai says he'd even considered just shutting down and leaving. But then he thought female staff who want to carry on anchoring with a mask can, while those who don't will get other jobs behind the scenes.
We will leave the last decision up to them. They will make their own decision.
And it's a tough decision for these women who braved the new Taliban regime to stay on the air, who've already adjusted their headscarves to hide their hair, and who now fear a steep slide back to the Middle Ages. Khatira says she's so stressed she couldn't even present her program properly.
It's not clear. Even if we appear with the burqa, maybe they will say that women's voices are forbidden. They want women to be removed from the screen. They are afraid of an educated woman.
Across town, the Taliban government spokesman Zabiullah Mujahid was attending a meeting with local journalists to mark a slightly delayed World Press Freedom Day. We stopped him on the way in.
You have said they have to wear a face mask if they're on television. Women. Why?
It's advisory from the ministry, he says.
But what does that mean? Is it compulsory?
If it is said, they should wear it. It'll be implemented as it is in our religion too, says Mujahid. It is good if it's implemented.
Afghan women are afraid that this is the beginning of your efforts to erase them from the workspace. They're afraid that if they wear the mask, the next thing you will say is their voice cannot be heard publicly. What is your response to that?
Like during COVID, he says, masks were mandatory. Women would only be wearing hijab or masks and they will continue their work. He seems to say that if women wear this, they can go to work. But the dress code edicts, like saying female university students must now wear black, not colored headscarves, is an escalating war of nerves, and everyone fears where this will lead. Back at Tolo News, these female anchors are distraught. What should we do, cries Tahmina. We don't know. We were ready to fight to the last to perform our work, but they don't allow us. We women have been taken hostage, says Hila. Women can't get themselves educated or work. Like me, who's worked on screen for years and couldn't leave Afghanistan. Due to the fear of the Taliban, I can't go on screen again. Since the Taliban takeover, the station's employed even more women than before because they need a safe space. And as for the actual journalism, Tolo News is Afghanistan's leading independent news channel. But director Sapai says they'll all quit the day the Taliban pressures them to tailor their coverage or lie to a public that's come to trust the truth they've been delivering over 20 years. He's saved the station so far, recruiting a whole new staff after most employees fled the Taliban's arrival.
And from management level, I've stood alone. And I was considered, I was only thinking that how to keep the screen alive, not to go dark.
The challenge now is keeping it from going dark. Christiana Manpour, CNN, Kabul, Afghanistan.
As you can see, the US withdrawal and subsequent fall of Kabul have changed the course of history for Afghanistan. And my next guest was there to document that. Photojournalist Marcus Yam won the Pulitzer Prize for breaking news photography last week. The judges said these raw and urgent images captured the human cost of the historic change in the country. Those images are powerful and distressing, and in some cases graphic. LA Times foreign correspondent and star photographer Marcus Yam joins me now from New York. I have to say, I looked at and consumed your photographs during the fall of Kabul. They are terrific. Before we take a look at somewhat of a catalogue of your shots, you've just heard our report there from Christian and heard the news that men now at Tolo News are wearing face masks in support of their female colleagues. What's your sense of that story and where that takes the country, given your experience there recently?
I mean, even as the country fell, and shortly afterwards, I spoke to many women who saw the writing on the wall. Many had expressed their fear and anxiety of what was to come, despite, at that point, the Taliban authorities saying that there will be a new Afghanistan, a new version of the rule, what they call Taliban 2.0. But many women already knew that, you know, they would somehow regress to a world where, you know, a reality where, you know, they're only spoken of by their mothers. And, you know, and in that sense, I feel like, well, it's not, I don't feel anything in that sense. I mean, I'm not, you know, but I have always just listened to people tell me and kind of tell me about their anxieties. And a lot of them some have fled. Some, you know, are brave enough to stay behind and resist. So
yeah, it's a sad, very, very sad state of affairs. Your work is remarkable. They say all news is history, and your work here has catalogued those fateful days in Kabul. When you were on the ground, and before we take a look at these shots, just very briefly, did it feel like something seismic was happening around you?
it definitely did feel like something seismic was happening. I mean, there's a confluence of so many things happening at the same time. It was, you know, is a historic event for both countries, Afghanistan and the United States. And it felt like walking into the unknown. And at the same time, it felt like, you know, the ground shifting for everyday Afghans. Their lives are transformed overnight, you know, and they had no say in this.
Let me pull up some of the images that you took. I mean, I have to warn our viewers, the first is quite graphic. It depicts two journalists and their wounds from Taliban torture. Just tell me their stories and why this happened to them.
These two journalists were journalists with the newspaper Atalat Roz, and they were doing their jobs. They were videographers for the newspaper, and they were out filming a protest in support, a rally in support of women's rights outside a police station, and they were immediately apprehended and then, you know, taken into the police station and beaten up. They were lucky enough they had handed off their cameras to, you know, friends and supporters who just rushed the cameras and footage out of there. But, you know, they weren't so lucky. I mean, they described to me, you know, how, you know, the kinds of people that were torturing them and what they would say to them. And at some point, you know, a Taliban fighter mocked one of them and said, you know, "Are you filming me now?" You know, after beating them up. And it was just horrendous. And when I met them, they were in so much pain they couldn't even sit down properly. And when I described to them what we wanted to do, they you know, they were so courageous. They agreed to just take off their clothes and, you know, drop their pants and turn around and you know, stoically just, you know, display their wounds. Like, you know, it looks as though like it was freshly painted on, you know, like like maps.
I've got to warn our viewers, this next photo is graphic and it's raw. It shows a child crying as behind him a man carries a blooded child. Just the third image I've got here is of a crowd of women and children who really are panicked at what is happening around them. Just walk me through these crowds, these crushing crowds and the mayhem that you must have experienced.
This, in the early days, I guess this photo was taken the day after the infamous moment where a U.S. transport airplane took off with Afghans clambering onto it. And I had made my way up to the airport, and the Taliban were using gunfire as crowd control. You know, pretty, you know, without any trigger discipline, I would say. And I was standing in the crowd of tens of thousands, you know, thousands of people just milling around, and I was just standing there trying to interview people. At some point I hear you know, a rattle of gunfire go off all at once, you know, and I see across the street, you know, this woman and this, you know, being dragged across the street with and a gentleman carrying this bloody baby towards me, and I just, you know, run towards them to intercept them and try to make this photo. It all happened very quickly. There was a child who looked me in the eye and just like screamed and really was, you know, didn't know what to make sense of it, how to make sense of it.
It is remarkable, isn't it? I mean, we've got another photo here which captures that sense of desperation most poignantly. I think those left behind, looking up at the sky, losing hope. I mean, let's just bring that image up. You had a roommate that we know quite well at CNN, also noted as quite extraordinary, her reporting, and that is, of course, Clarissa Ward. How did you both feel getting back to your accommodation after witnessing those scenes, day in, day out?
I would say when I got back after photographing that airport scene with the, you know, child shrieking and a bloody baby and a injured woman that was hurried away in a taxi cab, I sat there for a while, and I sat there and I thought about what I had just saw. I mean, it took me a while to press the send button, you know, and it took a while to process what I just seen. Like it hit me very, very hard that everything that the Afghans were afraid of is now coming into reality. I mean, it's one thing to watch it on a screen, on the news. It's another to actually experience it in firsthand and, you know, watch this indiscriminate violence take over their lives.
Marcus, your imagery is remarkable. We applaud you for the prize. I know that you will applaud those Afghans who have survived and continue to survive in a country which is so broken at present. It's a pleasure having you on. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. We are taking a very short break. Back after this. Well, it wasn't decided until the final minutes of the last game of the season, but that is why they call it the beautiful game. Reigning champions Manchester City captured the English Premier League title again, thanks to a dramatic comeback. It is the club's fourth EPL championship in 5 years and their eighth top-flight title in team history. It was looking like Liverpool would claim that title after Man City trailed Aston Villa 2-0 relatively late in the game, but City scored 3 goals in quick succession, giving them the title and sending the home fans into a frenzy. Alex Thomas from CNN World Sport joining me now from Manchester in England. This was ultimately the way I think that this season should have gone down. And what a cliffhanger, what an end to the season, and what an atmosphere there must be in Manchester, certainly one half of Manchester today, Alex.
Yeah, the sky blue half getting ready for a party here, Becky, there's no doubt about that. In the last few minutes, the gates open a bit further up Deansgate, one of the main streets here in the centre of Manchester. And as you can see, the fans let in, waving city flags, memorabilia, replica kits. I'm actually going to step out a shot just to show you what's going on here, because the parade is due to start any moment. It'll take place starting from Exchange Square, less than a mile away from where we are here, ending up at the stage you can see in the background there, with the current slogan for the year, Champions Again. The City fans getting used to winning Premier League titles now, Becky. Ever since the new owners arrived at the club back in 2008, 14 major trophies in the space of as many years. And as you say, a 4th Premier League title in 5 years. The 6th under the new owners, the 8th time they've been English champions in their long history, stretching back more than 100 years. But this is an unprecedented glut of silverware for the team. In a city that used to be ruled by the red of Manchester United, which we can't see because of the Champions Again sign, but Old Trafford is closer than the Etihad Stadium. But these days, it's the Sky Blue fans used to celebrating success rather than the United supporters.
Just soaking up the atmosphere with you there. As we said, it went right down to the wire. Liverpool fans, of course, you've got to feel sorry for them to a certain extent, Alex, haven't you, really? Because they thought not only were they going to clinch the EPL, but of course they're still in Champions League, a tournament Man City would have loved to have won this season. But I guess EPL League title winners is enough.
An historic quadruple of trophies was on the cards for Liverpool, and the amount of points they have won in recent seasons would have won Premier League titles in many of the previous years. Their rivalry with City is really driving English football forward, but as I said, it's all about Manchester City today and their celebrations.
Isn't it just? Lovely. Enjoy it. Alex Thomas on the ground there on the blue side, light blue side of Manchester. Thank you for joining us. We will see you same time, same place tomorrow.
Hello everyone, I'm Zain Asher in New York, and this is One World. Russian forces are pressing ahead with their offensive in eastern Ukraine, intent on capturing a key city and using what one local official is calling scorched earth tactics. But the front line has remained essentially static. Severodonetsk is crucial to controlling the Luhansk region. Kyiv says that Russian troops have repeatedly tried to break through, but so far they've been unsuccessful. Still, Ukraine's army is under intense pressure, and President Volodymyr Zelensky says up to 100 soldiers may be dying every single day defending eastern territory. To the south, the mayor of Mariupol warns his decimated city is on the brink of a health catastrophe brought on by warm weather, mass graves, and the breakdown of sewage systems. A Russian soldier convicted of killing an unarmed civilian could spend the rest of his days behind bars. A court in Kyiv found the 21-year-old tank commander guilty in Ukraine's very first war crimes trial since the Russian invasion. He was sentenced to life in prison. The soldier pleaded guilty last week, expressing his remorse for his actions and saying that, he was only acting on orders. He was only doing what he was told. The Kremlin says it's concerned about the soldier and will consider its options. CNN's Melissa Bell joins us live now from Kyiv. The Kremlin also saying, Melissa, that they're going to seek ways and think about ways to assist him. What do they mean by that, and what options do they have at their disposal?
It was an interesting change of tone from the Kremlin, frankly, Zain, this morning. Until now, day after day of this trial, and bear in mind that it's been going on for the best part of a week. Dmitry Peskov's been asked about it, and the Kremlin has said it doesn't really know much about it. Then this morning, a change of tone. That the Kremlin cared deeply about its soldiers, was following closely the fate of Vadim Shishimarin and would do what it could to help. And I think it's important, therefore, to remember also the context in which the sentence that was handed down to Vadim Shishimarin, that he will spend the rest of his life in jail, came today. It came even as, Zain, the Azovstal fighters that had fought until Friday, when the last of them were evacuated from the Azovstal plant to defend Mariupol, are now all prisoners of war in Russian hands. And we've been hearing noises from the Russian Ministry for Foreign Affairs, today, saying that Moscow might be willing to consider some sort of prisoner exchange for those Azovstal fighters, even as we heard from the head of the Donetsk People's Republic, where they're being held as prisoners of war, that a tribunal was being prepared. So it seems that that is the context in which Vadim Shishimarin received his sentence. That verdict took 50 minutes for the judge to read out, the judge going to great pains to explain the article of Ukrainian law, this is a civilian court, remember, under which Vadim Shishimarin was being found guilty, and that was of having committed premeditated murder in violation of the uses and customs of war. So that was handed down. But it was that process explained very clearly for 50 minutes, even as, remember, the speed with which this trial has been brought also matters to Ukrainian prosecutors, because it is coming even as the war rages on, and it is a message that they want to send to Russian soldiers still in the country. Have a listen to what the prosecutor had to say after that sentence was handed down.
Я думаю, що, можливо, це та стежина, яку ми протоптали, і по ній далі.
I think that all other law enforcement agencies will move along the path we have travelled. This will be a good example for other occupiers who may not yet be on our territory, but are planning to come, or those who are here now and plan to stay and fight. Or maybe they will think that it's time to leave here for their own territory.
So 21-year-old Vadim Shishimarin learned today to get back to his own personal case, Zain, that he will spend the rest of his life in jail. Just to remind you of the window that this trial provided on those early days of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and that's been the focus of a lot of the testimony that we've been hearing in his trial this week. He and other soldiers were part of a tank column. They hit a mine on the fourth day of the war. He and other soldiers managed to get away. He was given an order to shoot the civilian. His defense, that he was following orders. So this is an extreme extremely interesting trial in a Ukrainian civilian court where civilian law is being applied, Ukrainian civilian law, but this is also the beginning of so many more trials to come. There are some 13,000 war crimes that have been documented by Ukrainian authorities so far, and what Ukrainian prosecutors are telling us is that there are some crimes that Ukrainian courts cannot try. For instance, crimes against humanity, and they are looking forward to handing the evidence they've collected to the ICC.
All right, Melissa Bell, live for us there. Thank you so much. As Melissa mentioned, the Ukrainian soldiers who defended Mariupol until the very end will now face a tribunal. That's according to the pro-Russian separatist leader in Donetsk, who tells Russian state media documents for those tribunals are now being prepared. Russia's military says that more than 2,000 Ukrainians surrendered from Azovstal. Russia's deputy foreign minister says his country is open to a prisoner exchange. Suzanne Malveaux joins us live now from Lviv. In Ukraine. So, Suzanne, 2,000 soldiers here surrendering. A lot of concern, especially among their family members, about what happens to them next.
Absolutely. I spoke with Natalia Zaritsky, and she is very, very worried, very concerned, but she is doing everything she can to try to look for a sense of optimism, perhaps a source of hope. President Zelensky over the weekend threatening the Russians that if they destroy the people of Azovstal, that there will never be any type of negotiation or discussion. And also, hearing from the deputy foreign minister